They married me off to Coraline Shaw, the cursed witch of our enemy clan, the woman mothers used to frighten their children into behaving. My entire family laughed as they signed me away. "Let the failure rot with the snake," my father said, and my sister Genevieve actually clapped. On my wedding night, I sat on the edge of a stranger's bed in a stranger's mansion and waited for the knife I was certain would come between my ribs before dawn. Instead, my new wife walked in, dropped a thick folder on the table in front of me, and said, in a voice as cold and clear as winter glass, "Your sister has hired men to kill you tomorrow. Your father rewrote his will 3 days ago. Everything goes to your brother. I am the only person in this entire city who does not want you dead. So sit down, husband, let's talk." I looked at the folder. I looked at her. And for the first time in 26 years of being the Ashford family's designated disappointment, somebody had told me the truth, and it was my enemy. Let me back up, because you need to understand exactly how a man ends up praying his murderer will be his wife and being disappointed when she isn't. My name is Adrian Thorne, and until the night I'm telling you about, I was the least important member of the third richest family in Ashcroft City. The Ashford clan built its fortune over 4 generations, in shipping and steel, and in the modern era, in the kind of quiet financial instruments that make more money in an afternoon than most people see in a lifetime. My father, Arthur Caldwell, sat at the head of it like an old lion who had never once in his life been told no. My older brother Sebastian was the golden heir, groomed since birth, handsome and ruthless and adored. My younger sister Genevieve was the family's jewel, the one everyone underestimated because she smiled so sweetly, which was, I would learn far too late, exactly the point. And then there was me, the middle child, the one whose mother had died when I was 9 and whose place in the family had died with her. I don't say that for sympathy. I say it so you understand the shape of the trap. Because a trap is built out of a family's assumptions, and my family had assumed, for as long as I could remember, that I was worthless. Let me give you one memory, so you understand how it's done, how a family manufactures a disappointment. Because it's never one big cruelty, it's 1,000 small ones. A slow erosion so gradual the victim comes to believe the shape it carves is simply his true self. I was 8, the year before my mother died, and the family had gathered for my grandfather's birthday, the last patriarch before my father, and each of us children was to present the old man with a gift. Sebastian gave him a rare hunting rifle that had cost more than a house, purchased by our father and handed to Sebastian to present, so that the golden son could be praised for a generosity that wasn't his. Genevieve, 4 years old, gave him a drawing and was cooed over. And I, 8 years old, had spent 3 weeks building him something with my own hands. A small wooden model of the first Ashford ship, the one our fortune was founded on, carved and sanded and painted in secret in the corner of a shed because I wanted, so badly, to give him something that was actually mine. And I presented it, shaking with hope, and my father looked at the crude little wooden ship in my small hands, and he laughed. Not cruelly even, that was the worst part, just dismissively, the way you laugh at something beneath comment, and he said, "Well, at least the boy's good with his hands. We can always use another carpenter at the docks." And the whole family laughed, and my grandfather took Sebastian's rifle and never touched my ship. And I understood, at 8 years old, that in the Ashford family, a thing you made with love was worth less than a thing you bought with money and lied about, and that I would always be the one who made things with love, and would therefore always be worth less. My mother found me crying behind the shed afterward, and she picked up the little ship, which I'd thrown down, and she held it in both her hands and looked at it for a long time. And then she said the thing that kept me alive for the next 18 years. She said, "Adrian, listen to me, and remember it, because I won't always be here to say it. This ship is the only honest thing anyone gave your grandfather today. Everything else in that room was bought and borrowed and lied about. And this one small true thing made by one small true boy is worth more than all of it. And the fact that they can't see that is not a flaw in you, my darling. It is a flaw in them. And someday, it is going to be the thing that saves you. Because a family that cannot see worth is a family that will never see you coming." She kept that ship. I found it, years later, in her things, wrapped in cloth, and I have it still, on the desk in the house on the cliffs. The crude little wooden ship an 8-year-old made with love. The first true thing anyone ever told me was worth something. And I look at it sometimes and I think, you were right, Mother. They never saw me coming. Not once. Right up until the end. I wasn't stupid, and I wasn't weak, but I had made the one unforgivable mistake in a family like mine, which was to be gentle, to care about the people who worked our docks and our mills, to argue that the family's fortune had been built on their backs and owed them something. In the Ashford family, gentleness reads as weakness, and weakness reads as prey. And I had spent 26 years being quietly, systematically sorted to the bottom of my own bloodline, given nothing to do that mattered, mocked at every dinner, and passed over for every responsibility, until I was less a son than a family embarrassment kept around out of appearances. So when my father announced, 6 weeks before the night I'm telling you about, that I was to be married, I didn't even hope it might be good news. I knew better. Ashfords don't marry for love. We marry for leverage. And when he told me who, the whole table went silent, and then Genevieve started to laugh. Coraline Shaw. The Thornes were our enemies, had been for 2 generations, a rival clan of nearly equal wealth and considerably more menace. And Coraline Shaw was their most notorious member, the granddaughter of the old Thorne patriarch, a woman the whole city whispered about. They called her the Cursed Witch. They said 3 men who had crossed her had died in ways the police never explained. They said she'd driven her own mother to the grave and frozen out half her own family. They said she was cold, that she was cruel, that she had ice where a heart should be, and that any man foolish enough to marry her would not live out the year. Ashcroft City had built her into a monster the way cities do, one rumor at a time, until the name Coraline Shaw was less a person than a threat you used to scare people. And my family was giving me to her. I understood the arithmetic even then. On paper, it was a peace marriage, an alliance to end the Ashford-Thorne feud, a grand gesture of reconciliation between 2 great houses, and the whole city applauded my father's statesmanship. Underneath, I knew exactly what it was. It was a way to be rid of me. If the cursed witch killed her useless new husband, as everyone fully expected, then the Ashfords lost nothing they valued, gained a legal claim against the Thornes for the death of their son, and washed their hands of the family disappointment in a single elegant stroke. I was not a groom, I was bait, and everyone at that table knew it, and everyone at that table thought it was funny. "Try to survive the honeymoon, little brother," Sebastian said, lifting his glass, and the whole family laughed, and my father smiled the smile of a man who had solved a small, persistent problem, and Genevieve, my sweet-faced sister, leaned over and whispered, "So." Only I could hear, "I'll take good care of your things after you're gone," and kissed my cheek. I should have understood, in that moment, that a person does not say a thing like that as a joke. But I was so used to being the family's punching bag that I heard cruelty and thought nothing of murder. That was my mistake. It was the same mistake I'd been making my whole life, and it very nearly killed me. The wedding itself was a spectacle, because the merger of 2 great clans is always a spectacle. 500 guests, a cathedral, cameras, the whole glittering machine of Ashcroft society assembled to watch the failure son shackled to the witch. I remember the sound most of all. Not the organ, not the vows. The whispering. 500 of the most powerful people in the city leaning to one another behind their programs, and the word that moved through that cathedral like a draft. Witch. 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 And under it the other word, the one meant for me. Poor Adrian. Poor, stupid Adrian. Do you think he even knows what they're doing to him? I stood at that altar in a suit that cost more than a dock worker earns in 3 years, and I have never in my life felt so completely alone. And I remember thinking, quite calmly, that if the woman walking toward me really was what they said she was, if she really did kill her husbands, then at least it would be quick, and at least someone in this cathedral would have finally taken an interest in me. That is the state my family had reduced me to on my wedding day. I was not hoping to survive. I was hoping to matter to someone, even as a victim. And then she came down the aisle, and the whispering stopped, because Coraline Shaw in her black wedding dress, and yes, she wore black, deliberately, defiantly, to a cathedral wedding, was the most self-possessed human being any of those 500 people had ever seen. And she walked past every one of them like they were furniture. And she took her place beside me, and she did not look at me once during the entire ceremony. And I thought, she despises me too. Of course she does. Everyone does. I know now what she was actually doing. She was memorizing the room. She was cataloging every Ashford face, every hired guard, every exit, because she had known for 6 weeks that a trap was coming, and she did not yet know which of them would spring it. She told me later that she'd been so focused on the assassins in the room that she hadn't looked at me properly until the vows, and that when she finally did, when she turned and saw my face, she'd felt something she hadn't expected and hadn't wanted, which was pity. Because, she said, you looked like a man attending his own funeral and trying to be polite about it. I met Coraline Shaw for the first time at the altar. She was, I will admit, the most striking woman I had ever seen. Tall and pale and severe, dark hair, darker eyes, dressed in a gown the color of a bruise. And she looked at me across the altar with an expression of such complete, glacial indifference that I felt my stomach drop, because the rumors, standing before her, seemed suddenly very believable. She said her vows in a flat voice. I said mine in a shaking one. She did not smile once. When the officiant said I could kiss the bride, she turned her cheek to me with the enthusiasm of a woman offering her hand to a snake, and the whole cathedral watched the doomed man kiss the cursed witch, and somewhere in the front pews, I heard my sister stifle a laugh. At the reception, my family didn't even pretend. My father shook the Vorn patriarch's hand for the cameras, and then spent the entire evening on the far side of the room, as if proximity to me might be contagious. Sebastian gave a toast so laced with mockery dressed as affection that half the room laughed and the other half winced. And Coraline sat beside me like a statue carved out of contempt, saying nothing, touching nothing, radiating a cold that kept even the boldest guests 3 feet away. I remember thinking, numbly, halfway through that endless night, that I was going to die soon, married and alone and unmourned, and that the only person in the room who didn't seem to be actively enjoying it was the witch they'd married me to, who simply looked bored, as if my death were a chore she was mildly dreading. I was so wrong about her that even now it takes my breath away. When the reception finally ended, a Vorn car took us to the Vorn estate, a vast, dark mansion on the North Cliffs that looked exactly like the kind of place a cursed witch would live, and a silent servant showed me to a bedroom and left me there, and I sat on the edge of the bed in my wedding suit and I waited to die. I'm not being dramatic. I genuinely believed that Coraline Shaw was going to kill me that night, because everyone had told me she would. My whole family had all but promised it, and I had spent 26 years believing what my family told me. I even, God help me, understood it. If I were a monster married against my will to a stranger from an enemy clan, maybe I'd want him gone too. So I sat, and I waited, and I listened to the enormous house tick and settle around me, and I thought about my mother, the only person who had ever loved me, dead 17 years, and I thought about how nobody in the world would notice I was gone. And I was, I think, halfway to accepting it, when the door opened and Coraline Shaw walked in. She had changed out of the bruise-colored gown into plain dark clothes, and she'd taken her hair down, and without the armor of the wedding, she looked younger, and tired, and human in a way she hadn't at the altar. She was carrying a folder, thick, worn, the kind of folder that holds a lot of paper and a lot of trouble. She crossed the room without looking at me, dropped the folder on the table by the window, and then she turned and studied me with those dark eyes. And it was not the look of a woman about to commit murder. It was the look of a general assessing whether a battered recruit was worth saving. "You've been sitting there waiting for me to kill you," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I admitted, because there was no point lying. "Everyone told me you would." "Everyone told you a great many things," Coraline said, "and every single one of them was a lie, and you believed all of them, which is the first thing about you I'm going to have to fix, because a man who believes what his enemies tell him is a man who has never once been told the truth. And Adrian, you are about to be told a great deal of it, and you are not going to enjoy it." She tapped the folder. "Sit down. Open that, and prepare yourself, because in the next 10 minutes, I'm going to prove to you that the cursed witch you were terrified of is the only friend you have left in the world, and that the family sleeping soundly across this city tonight is the thing that's actually going to kill you." I did not move, and here is the strangest part. The part I have never been able to explain to anyone who wasn't in that room, which is that I was not surprised. That is what my family had made of me. A woman I had never met told me that my own sister had purchased my murder, and the feeling that went through me was not shock, it was recognition. The sick, quiet, almost restful recognition of a thing you have known in your body for years and never let yourself say. Of course they had. Of course. It was the only ending that made sense of my whole life. And I think Coraline saw that on my face, saw that I had accepted the news of my own murder the way a man accepts a diagnosis he'd already guessed. And I think it was in that second, before either of us spoke another word, that something in her decided about me. Because she told me later that she had walked into that bedroom prepared to find an entitled fool she'd have to bully into cooperating. And instead she found a man who wasn't even shocked that his family wanted him dead. And it was the saddest thing I had ever seen, and I thought, oh, they did to you what they did to me, only slower. I stared at her, this woman I'd been taught to fear my entire life, standing in the lamplight with a folder full of my own death, and I heard myself ask the only question that mattered. "Why?" I said. "Why would you help me? We've never met. Our families hate each other. You didn't want this marriage any more than I did. So why, on the one night everyone in this city expects you to put a knife in me, would you instead try to save my life?" And Coraline Shaw looked at me for a long moment, and something moved behind the ice in her eyes, something I would come to know very well in the months that followed. An old, deep, carefully hidden anger. The anger of a person who has also been sorted to the bottom of a cruel family and called a monster for surviving it. "Because," she said quietly, "I know exactly what it feels like to be the one your own blood decided to throw away. They call me a witch, Adrian. Do you want to know what I actually did to earn that name? I noticed things, that's all. I noticed my family was rotten, and I said so out loud. And for the crime of seeing clearly, they spent 10 years turning me into a monster, so no one would ever believe a word I said. Sound familiar?" She pulled out the chair across from the table and sat, folding her hands. "Your family did the same thing to you, more quietly, but the same. They made you small, so that when they finally threw you away, no one would look too closely. Well, I looked closely. I've been looking closely at your family for 2 years, because your family and my family are more alike than either of them would ever admit. And what I found is in that folder, and it is going to make you very angry. And good, because anger is the only thing that's going to keep you alive past tomorrow morning. So," she gestured at the chair beside me, at the folder, at the whole impossible night. "Sit down, husband. We have exactly 1 night before your sister's men arrive, and a great deal to discuss. Let's talk." And I sat down, and I opened the folder, and the last night of my old life ended, and the first night of the one where I finally learned to fight began. The folder was organized the way a mind like hers organized everything, ruthlessly, in sections, each one worse than the last. The first section was the will. My father's will, dated 3 days before my wedding, a certified copy Coraline's people had somehow obtained, and I read it twice before I understood what I was looking at. In the old will, the one I'd always assumed existed, I received a modest share, a token, the crumbs the family threw the disappointment. In this new one, dated 3 days ago, I received nothing. Not a token, not a crumb. My entire share, my mother's inheritance included, the small trust she'd left me that was the one thing in the world that was actually mine, all of it redirected. Everything to Sebastian, with Genevieve as secondary. And there was a clause, a specific clause, that Coraline had circled in red, a clause stating that in the event of my death, my share of the marital assets from the Thorne alliance reverted entirely to the Ashford estate. "Do you understand what that clause means?" Coraline said, watching my face. I did, slowly, sickeningly. "It means I'm worth more to them dead than alive," I said. "It means the marriage isn't the disposal. The marriage is the setup. If I die married to a Thorne, the alliance assets flow back to my father, and he gets to sue your family for my murder on top of it." "Now you're thinking," she said. "Keep going." The second section was the assassins. Photographs, a contract, financial records, the kind of evidence that does not appear by accident. 3 men, professionals, hired through a cutout to make the trail hard to follow, but Coraline's people were better at following trails than my sister's people were at hiding them. The contract specified a date, tomorrow, and a location, the Thorne estate, and a method, something that would look like a robbery gone wrong, the tragic murder of the Ashford son by intruders on his second night in the witch's house, a death that everyone in the city was already primed to expect, because everyone in the city already believed Coraline Shaw was going to kill me. That was the genius of it, the part that made my hands go cold. My family hadn't just arranged my murder, they'd spent weeks arranging the story of my murder first, feeding the city's belief that the witch would kill me, so that when I died, no one would look at the Ashfords at all. The rumors about Coraline weren't just cruelty, they were an alibi being built in advance. "The men who signed this contract," Coraline said, "were hired by a shell company. The shell company is controlled by a management firm. The management firm has one client whose instructions it follows without question." She reached over and turned to the last page of that section, where a single name was printed, and it was my sister's name, Genevieve Sterling. "Your sweet little sister," Coraline said, "has been running a private security and, let us call it, problem resolution operation out of the Ashford holdings for 3 years, entirely off the books, and your father either doesn't know or pretends not to. And either way, Adrian, the person who signed the order for your death is the same person who kissed your cheek at dinner and told you she'd take good care of your things." I sat very still. I thought about Genevieve's sweet face, her soft laugh, the way she'd whispered in my ear at the engagement dinner, "I'll take good care of your things after you're gone." Not a joke, a promise. and I felt something happen in my chest that had never happened before in 26 years of being the family disappointment. A cold, clean, quiet fury. The kind that doesn't burn, the kind that focuses. "Okay," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. "You've proven your point. My family is trying to kill me. Now prove the other one. Why do you care? You said you'd been looking at my family for 2 years. Why? What does the cursed witch of the Vorn clan want with the Ashford disappointment badly enough to warn him instead of just letting his sister's men finish the job? Because forgive me, Coraline, but I've learned tonight that everyone who says they're helping me is usually the one holding the knife, so I need to hear your angle, and I need it to be true, because I can tell when you're managing me, you've been doing it since you walked in." Something flickered across her face, and for just a second the ice cracked into something that looked almost like respect. "Good," she said softly. "You're not as broken as they made you. All right, my angle. The truth, since you asked for it, and since you're the first person in a long time to notice I was managing them." She stood and walked to the window and looked out at the dark cliffs and the city lights far below, and when she spoke, her voice had lost its glacial control and become something rawer, something real. "You think you have it bad," she said. "You're the family disappointment. Well, I'm the family monster, and it's a worse job, because a disappointment they ignore, a monster they have to actively contain. 10 years ago, I was just the Vorn granddaughter who asked too many questions. My grandfather, the old patriarch, he loved me, he was grooming me, because I was the only one of his descendants with any spine, and he was going to name me his heir. And then, he had a stroke. And while he was lying in a hospital bed, unable to speak, my Uncle Gareth took control of the Vorn holdings as regent, and my Uncle Gareth has spent the 10 years since bleeding this family dry and preparing to make his control permanent. And the only person who ever stood in his way, the only person who ever said out loud that the numbers didn't add up and the money was going somewhere it shouldn't, was me." She turned back to face me. "So he did to me exactly what your family did to you, only louder. He couldn't just ignore me. I was too visible, too close to the inheritance. So he built me into a monster. Every rumor you've ever heard about me, the dead men, the driven mad mother, the ice where a heart should be, every one of them traces back to my Uncle Gareth's people. A decade of patient, expensive character assassination, until the granddaughter who was going to inherit became the witch no one would follow, no one would believe, no one would stand beside. Do you want to know how one of those rumors is actually built? The one about my mother? They say I drove her mad, that I was so cold and so cruel that my own mother lost her mind and died of it. Here is the truth. My mother was the first person Gareth isolated, because my mother believed me. My mother saw what her brother-in-law was doing and stood with me. And so Gareth did to her what he later did to me. He built her into something no one would listen to, and he did it faster and more cruelly because she was more fragile than I am. He moved her doctors, he controlled her medication, he arranged for her to seem confused in front of the right witnesses, and grieving, and unstable. And then, when she was thoroughly discredited, when no one in the family would take her seriously anymore, she did lose her grip. Because that is what happens to a person who tells the truth and watches everyone she loves be turned against her. And when she died, worn down and alone and disbelieved, Gareth simply pointed at me and said, "The daughter drove her to it, the cold girl, the strange one." And a family already primed to see me as trouble believed him, because it is always easier to believe a young woman is a monster than to believe an old man is. I watched my mother be erased and then blamed for her own erasure. And I was 14, and I could prove nothing. And I learned, at 14, the lesson that made me who I am, which is that the truth is not enough, that being right is not a shield, that a person who sees clearly in a family of liars is not safe. She is marked, and that if I wanted to survive, I would have to become as careful and as patient and as ruthless as the man who'd killed my mother's mind. Because gentleness had gotten her erased, and I could not afford to be erased. I had to be there, at the end, to make him pay. So I became cold. Not because I was born cold, Adrian. I want you to understand that. I was not born the witch they made me. I was a girl who loved her mother and lost her to a patient monster and decided, over her grave, that she would never again be soft enough to be erased. Every year of ice I wear, my uncle put on me. And the cruelest part, the part I have never said out loud to anyone until you, is that it worked. The ice worked. I survived where my mother didn't, precisely because I let them make me the witch. Because a monster is harder to erase than a victim. and so I have spent 10 years being the thing that killed my own mother's memory in order to avenge her. And there are nights I cannot tell anymore where the armor ends and I begin. And that is what your family and mine actually do to people. They do not just kill you. They make you into your own murderer's shape in order to survive them. And then they call the shape your fault. He made me radioactive, Adrian, so that when my grandfather finally dies, and he's close now, no one in this family or this city will support my claim over his, because who would follow a monster? That's what they did to me. They didn't kill me. They made me into someone no one would mourn, which is worse, because then they can kill you whenever they like, and the whole world will nod along. I understood then why she'd looked at me the way she did. Not with contempt, with recognition. So that's my angle, Coraline said, coming back to the table, sitting down across from me, and for the first time she looked me full in the face without any armor at all. I've been investigating your family for 2 years because your family and my uncle are connected, Adrian. The Ashford-Vaughan feud that everyone thinks is real, the ancient blood hatred between our clans, the thing this marriage is supposedly ending? I don't think it's real. I think it's a stage play. I think somewhere behind the feud, your father and my uncle are not enemies at all. And I think this marriage, the one that's supposed to make peace between our houses, was arranged by the two of them together. And I think it was arranged for one purpose, to put the two inconvenient children, the disappointment and the monster, in the same house on the same night, so that we could die together and each family could blame the other, and the feud could rage on as cover, while the two men who secretly run both clans divide everything between them. We weren't married to make peace, husband. We were married to be buried in the same grave. The room was silent. Far below, the city glittered, oblivious. And I looked at Coraline Shaw, the cursed witch, my enemy, my wife, the only person in the world who didn't want me dead, and I understood that we were not two victims of two separate cruelties. We were two halves of the same trap, and the men who'd built it had made exactly one mistake. They'd assumed that putting a disappointment and a monster in the same room would produce two corpses. They'd never once considered that it might produce allies. So here's what I'm offering, Coraline said, and she extended her hand across the table, pale and steady in the lamplight. Not a marriage, a partnership. You have an Ashford name, Ashford access, and a lifetime of being underestimated by the exact people we need to destroy, which is the single most valuable weapon in this entire city, and you've never once thought to use it. I have 2 years of evidence, a network your family doesn't know exists, and a very personal understanding of how to take a great house apart from the inside. Separately, we're a disappointment and a monster, and we die tomorrow. Together, Adrian, we are the two people who understand these families better than the families understand themselves, and I genuinely think, we can burn both of these rotten houses to the ground and build something out of the ashes that actually belongs to us. But I need to know right now, tonight, before your sister's men arrive, whether you're the gentle failure they told me about, or whether there's something underneath that they were right to be afraid of. So, husband. Her dark eyes held mine, and her hands stayed extended between us, an offer and a test at once. Do we talk, or do we fight? Because I promise you, we cannot do both, and dawn is coming, and your sister's men are already on their way. I looked at her hand. I looked at the folder, at the will, at the contract with my sister's name on it, at 26 years of being told I was worthless by people who were, this whole time, quietly planning to kill me. And I reached across the table, and I took the cursed witch's hand, and I shook it, and I heard my own voice come out of me, clear and cold and certain in a way it never had in my whole life. We talk, I said, and then, Coraline, we burn it all down. Where do we start? And Coraline Shaw smiled, the first real smile I ever saw on her face, and it was not the smile of a witch. It was the smile of a woman who had been alone in a war for 10 years and had just, finally, gained an ally. We start, she said, with the 3 men coming to kill you tomorrow. Because the first rule of a war like this, husband, is that when your enemy hands you an assassination, you don't survive it. You use it. We didn't sleep that night. We planned. And watching Coraline Shaw plan was the first time in my life I understood what people meant when they talked about genius, because she didn't think the way normal people think, in straight lines, one step at a time. She thought in whole structures, seeing the entire board at once, every piece, every counter, 3 moves ahead of a game I hadn't even known I was playing. The men arrive tomorrow night, she said, spreading papers across the table. Their contract specifies a robbery gone wrong, so we're going to give them exactly the scene they expect, right up until the moment we don't. Here's the thing about hired killers, Adrian. They're not loyal. They're paid. And a man who's paid can be paid more. Or, better, can be frightened into understanding that the people who hired him have already decided he's a loose end. Which, in this case, happens to be true. Your sister does not leave witnesses. The 3 men who kill you tomorrow would not survive the week, because Genevieve would tie off that thread the moment it stopped being useful. So we're not going to fight them. We're going to inform them. She looked up at me. We're going to let them get all the way to the moment of the job, and then we're going to show them the evidence that their employer has already scheduled their deaths, and we're going to offer them the one thing your sister never would, a way out, in exchange for their testimony. Turn the weapon around. It's cheaper than a fight, and it's worth infinitely more, because a dead assassin proves nothing, but a living one who names your sister on record is a bomb we can plant under the whole Ashford family and detonate whenever we choose. I stared at her. And if they say no? If they just decide to do the job and take their chances? Coraline's mouth curved, cold and certain. Then my people, who will be positioned throughout this house, and who are considerably more competent than 3 cut-rate contract men, will resolve the situation, and will be no worse off than we are now. But they won't say no. I've read their files. These aren't fanatics, they're businessmen, and I'm going to make them a better business offer than your sister did, and I'm going to do it while holding the proof that she's already planning to kill them. Fear plus profit, Adrian. It's the only reliable currency in a city like this, and your sister taught it to them first. We're just going to teach it better. She was right. Of course she was right. I would spend the next several months learning that Coraline Shaw was almost always right, in the specific, infuriating way of a person who has been forced to be right in order to survive. Because a monster the whole world is watching for a mistake does not get to make mistakes. The next day passed in a strange, taut calm. To the household, to the servants Coraline didn't fully trust, to any eyes that might be reporting back, we performed the roles we'd been assigned, the doomed husband and the icy witch, barely speaking, keeping our distance. But underneath, all day, her people moved through the great house like water, and by nightfall the trap was set. And I stood in the bedroom where I'd been meant to die, wearing clothes I could move in, my heart hammering, while Coraline checked a small pistol with the casual competence of a woman who had learned long ago that a monster keeps her own weapons. You don't have to be in here, she said, not looking up. I could put you somewhere safe and handle it. No, I said, and I meant it. If we're partners, I'm not going to spend our first night hiding while you do the dangerous part. Besides, I managed something that was almost a smile. They're here to kill me. I'd like to see their faces when they find out I'm the least of their problems. Coraline glanced up at me, and something in her expression shifted. A reassessment. The look of a woman revising an estimate upward. Huh, she said. Maybe they were wrong about you after all. The men came a little after midnight, exactly as the contract had specified. 3 of them, professional and quiet, through a side entrance a servant had been paid to leave unlocked. And they moved through the dark house toward the bedroom with the unhurried confidence of men who believed they were hunting a soft target in a hostile house where his death was expected and would be blamed on someone else. They had no idea they were walking into the one house in the city where someone had read their contract. What happened next was less a fight than a demonstration. The moment they entered the bedroom, the lights came up, and Coraline's people were simply there, in every doorway, more of them and better positioned than 3 men could hope to counter. And the assassins froze in that terrible instant when a professional realizes the job has gone wrong before it began. And then Coraline stepped forward, calm as winter, and she did not point a gun at them. She held up a folder. Before anyone does anything regrettable, she said, you should know 3 things. 1. You are outnumbered and outpositioned, and if this becomes a fight, you lose it, and you know you lose it, because you're professionals and you can count. 2. She opened the folder and turned it toward them, and I watched the lead assassin's eyes drop to the page and go very still. This is a communication from your employer, dated tomorrow morning, arranging for the 3 of you to be eliminated as loose ends within 72 hours of completing this job. I'll let you read it. Take your time. It's quite detailed. She was going to have you killed at a construction site in the East District, if you're curious about the specifics, which are, I'll admit, insultingly cheap. She valued your 3 lives at less than she paid you for this one job. And 3. She closed the folder. I am prepared to offer you a great deal of money, safe passage out of this city, and permanent protection from the woman who just signed your death warrants in exchange for one thing. Your testimony, on record, naming Genevieve Sterling as the person who hired you to murder my husband. That's it. That's the whole deal. Walk out of here rich and alive and useful, or fight 3-to-1 odds for an employer who's already planning your funerals. You have 30 seconds, and I genuinely recommend the smart choice, because it's rare in this business that the smart choice and the survivable one are the same, and you should take advantage while they are. For a moment, it hung in the balance, and it could have gone the other way. The lead assassin, a lean, scarred man who had clearly survived a long career by trusting no one, did not immediately fold. His eyes moved over Coraline's people, counting, calculating, and I saw him weigh the odds of fighting against the humiliation of being turned. And I saw his pride push him toward the blade, because a professional who lets himself be talked down is a professional whose reputation dies, and reputation was the only thing men like him truly owned. His hand tightened on his weapon. And that was the moment I did the thing Coraline had not planned, the thing that came from the part of me my family had mocked my whole life. I stepped forward, past Coraline, unarmed, into the space between the killers and the guns, which was possibly the stupidest thing I had ever done, and Coraline hissed my name, but I kept going. And I looked the lead man in the eyes, and I did not threaten him, and I did not bargain with him. I just spoke to him like a person, because that was the one thing no one in this whole vicious city ever did. "You don't know me," I said. "I'm the man you came here to kill, and I'm not going to pretend I understand your life, or judge it. But I'm going to tell you something true, because I think you've been lied to as much as I have. My sister hired you to murder a stranger on his wedding night, and then she scheduled your deaths for 3 days later, and she did both of those things without losing a minute of sleep, because to her, you're exactly what I've been to my family my whole life, a thing to be used and thrown away. You and I, right now, in this room, we're the same to them. People who sent us here. Disposable. And I've spent my whole life being disposable, and I've just tonight learned that I don't have to be. That there's another way, and I'm offering you the same door someone just offered me. You don't have to die for people who already wrote your funerals. You can walk out of here and be nobody's tool ever again. That's not a threat, and it's not a bribe. It's just the truth, from one disposable man to another. Take the door." And the scarred man looked at me for a long, long moment. This soft-spoken stranger he'd been paid to murder, standing unarmed and unafraid in front of him talking about doors. And something shifted in his face. Something that had nothing to do with fear or greed. Something older and more human. The recognition of one used-up man by another. I watched 3 hardened killers do the math. I watched the exact moment fear and greed tipped them, the same currency Coraline had named, the currency my sister had taught them first, and I watched the lead man slowly, carefully, set down his weapon. And I understood that I had just witnessed my wife win a war without firing a shot. And I understood that I was, for the first time in my life, on the winning side of something. By dawn, we had it. 3 signed statements, recorded testimony, the whole chain from the shell company to the management firm to Genevieve Sterling's own instructions. A bomb built and buried and ready. Coraline's people spirited the 3 men out of the city to somewhere safe, and Coraline and I stood alone in the gray morning light in the bedroom where I was supposed to be a corpse. And she looked at me, and I looked at her, and neither of us said anything for a long moment, because something had changed in the night, something neither of us had planned for. We'd started the night as strangers forced together by men who wanted us dead. We ended it as something else. Not friends, not yet, but allies, real ones, the kind forged in the specific fire of having survived the same trap together. "They think you're dead," Coraline said finally, quietly. "Right now, across the city, your sister is waiting for the call that never comes. Your father is preparing to grieve for the cameras and sue my family for your murder. In a few hours, when the call doesn't come, they're going to start to worry, and then they're going to start to wonder. And that, husband, is when the real game begins. Because a predator who has just discovered the prey isn't dead is the most dangerous and the most careless it will ever be." So, she held out her hand again, the way she had the night before, but it meant something different now. Partners. For real. All the way to the end of both these families. "Are you in?" And I took her hand, and this time, I didn't let go right away, and neither did she. And in the gray dawn of the morning I was supposed to die, the disappointment and the monster shook on the ruin of 2 great houses. "All the way to the end," I said. Meanwhile, across the city, in the Ashford mansion, my sister Genevieve sat by a silent phone and waited for news of my death. And it did not come. And she was not yet worried, because the professionals she'd hired were reliable, and a job like mine was simple. And there was no reason on earth to think that the cursed witch and the family failure had spent the night doing anything but exactly what everyone expected. She had no idea. She sipped her coffee, and she checked the phone, and she began, without knowing it, to lose a war she was still certain she'd already won. The call came at 10 in the morning, and it was me who made it. And that was Coraline's idea, and it was perfect. "Don't hide," she'd said over breakfast, the first meal we ever ate as genuine allies, and I remember being struck by how strange it was to share a table with someone who wasn't waiting for me to fail. "If you vanish, they'll know something's wrong, and they'll adapt. But if you call your loving father this morning, cheerful, alive, grateful for the beautiful wedding, then you become the most confusing thing in the world to them, a target that didn't die and doesn't know it was supposed to." Confusion makes people careless, so call your father, be sweet, be dumb, be exactly the harmless disappointment they think you are. And let's watch what they do when the corpse phones home. So I called. And I have to tell you, playing the oblivious fool for the family that had just tried to murder me was the first genuinely satisfying thing I'd done in years, because for once, the mask of the harmless failure wasn't a cage, it was a weapon, and I wore it on purpose. "Father," I said warmly, when Arthur Caldwell answered, and I heard the fractional pause on the line, the tiny hitch of a man hearing a voice he'd been told he wouldn't hear again. "I just wanted to thank you. For the wedding. For all of it. Coraline and I, well, we're getting along much better than anyone expected. I think this might really work. I think I might finally have found my place." The silence on the line was exquisite. I could hear my father recalculating, that old lion mind turning over the impossible fact of my survival. And when he spoke, his voice was smooth as ever. But I knew him well enough now, knew what to listen for, and underneath the warmth I heard it, the cold, flat note of a man whose plan had just developed a problem. "Adrian," he said, "my boy, that's wonderful news, wonderful. Your sister will be so relieved. We were all so worried about you, married into that family." "Coraline's been perfectly kind," I said, laying it on. "I don't understand why everyone says such awful things about her. Anyway, I won't keep you. I just wanted you to know I'm happy, Father. For the first time in a long time, I'm really happy." And I hung up, and I looked at Coraline, who had been listening on the line, and she was almost smiling. "Oh, that was cruel," she said with something like admiration. "Telling him you're happy? You just told a man who spent a fortune to kill you that his money didn't work, and you're grateful to him for it. He's going to spend all day trying to figure out if you know." "Do you think he suspects?" "He suspects everything, always. That's how men like him survive." But suspecting and knowing are different, and right now he's off balance, and an off-balance enemy reveals his network, trying to steady himself. Watch. Within a day, someone your father trusts is going to reach out to you, all warmth and concern, to find out how much you know. And when they do, we'll have our first thread into the real conspiracy. Because your father won't come himself, and he won't send Genevieve. He'll send whoever he uses for delicate problems. And that person, husband, is a name I very much want. She was right within 6 hours. It was Sebastian who called, my golden brother, all easy charm, inviting me to lunch, just the two of us, to celebrate the marriage and clear the air after years of, as he put it, us not being as close as brothers should be. I nearly laughed out loud. Sebastian had never once in 26 years wanted to be close to me. But Coraline had predicted the reach, and here it was. And so I accepted, warmly, gratefully, the eager disappointment thrilled to finally be included, and I hung up and looked at my wife. "My brother," I said. "Lunch." To clear the air. "Of course it's the brother," Coraline said, and she pulled out a fresh legal pad and began, in her precise hand, to build the day's strategy. "Sebastian's the will's beneficiary and your father's blade. If your father wants to know what you know without showing his hand, he sends Sebastian, who can play the affectionate brother while he takes your measure. So here's what you're going to do at that lunch, Adrian, and it's going to be the hardest performance of your life, because you're going to sit across from a man who wants you dead, and you're going to be so warm, so open, so pathetically grateful for his attention that he walks away certain you know nothing and suspect nothing and are exactly the harmless fool he's always believed. You're going to lose to him, on purpose, completely, and he's going to love it, because nothing makes a predator careless like a prey that adores him. And while you're doing that, I'm going to be doing the real work, because a lunch invitation from your brother means your brother is out of his office for 2 hours, and there are things in your brother's office I've wanted to see for a very long time." I looked at her. "You're going to break into Sebastian's office while I distract him?" "I'm going to conduct a discreet, unauthorized review of your brother's private records," Coraline corrected, "while my husband keeps him occupied at a restaurant, yes. Marriage is teamwork, Adrian. Now let's talk about how you're going to survive 2 hours alone with a man who tried to have you killed without letting him see that you'd like to return the favor. Before I go on, I need to tell you about the other thing that happened that first strange week, because it changed everything, and it started with a person I'd almost forgotten. His name was Silas Croft, and he had been the Ashford family's driver, and more quietly, my mother's most loyal servant, for 30 years. And after my mother died, he'd been shuffled off to some minor post in the family's dockside operations. Out of sight, out of mind. And I had not spoken to him in years, because I'd been taught to believe that the failure son had no business maintaining relationships with the help. But Silas had loved my mother, and Silas had, in his quiet way, always been kind to me. And when the news of my marriage reached the docks, Silas did something that told me everything about the difference between the people my family valued and the people who actually mattered. He sent me a letter. A real letter, handwritten, delivered by a dockhand he trusted, addressed to me at the Thorne estate, and it said, in his careful, old-fashioned hand, that he had heard about the marriage, and that he wanted me to know that my mother had never trusted the direction the family was moving, that in her last months she had confided to him fears she never spoke to anyone else, and that if I ever needed a friend who remembered who the Ashfords used to be before they became what they are now, I had one, at the docks, always. I read that letter 3 times, and then I showed it to Coraline, and Coraline read it once and looked up with a sharp new light in her dark eyes. "Your mother had fears," she said slowly, "in her last months, about the direction the family was moving." She set the letter down with great care. "Adrian, when did your mother die?" 17 years ago. I was 9. "And how did she die?" I had never questioned it. It was one of those facts you absorb as a child and never examine. "An illness," I said. "Sudden." "Her heart," they said, and Coraline Shaw looked at me across the table, and she did not say the thing she was thinking, because she was kind enough to let me arrive at it myself. But I saw it land in her eyes, and I felt the floor of my whole life shift beneath me, because a woman who had fears about the direction her powerful family was moving, and who then died suddenly of a sudden heart, 17 years ago, at the exact moment those fears might have become inconvenient, was not necessarily a woman who died of an illness. "We're going to need to talk to Silas Croft," Coraline said quietly. "Soon, but carefully, because if your mother knew something, and if what she knew is connected to what your family is doing now, then Adrian, the trap we're in didn't start with your wedding. It started 17 years ago, and it's a great deal bigger and older than either of us thought, and the people who built it have had 17 years of practice getting away with murder." Meanwhile, in the Ashford mansion, my father sat with my sister in his study, and the mood was not celebratory. "He called me," Arthur Caldwell said, "this morning, cheerful, thanking me." Genevieve's sweet face had gone very still. "The men didn't report in. I assumed they were being cautious, but if he's alive and thanking you—" "Then either your men failed and ran," my father said, "or something happened in that house that we don't understand, and I do not like things I don't understand, Genevieve, particularly things involving that family, particularly now, with everything else in motion." He was silent for a moment, an old lion scenting the wind. "Send Sebastian to take his measure. If Adrian is simply the fool he's always been, we'll arrange something quieter and cleaner. But if that witch has gotten to him, if he knows anything—" He turned to look out the window toward the North Cliffs, toward the Thorne estate, toward the son who wouldn't die. "Then we've made a mistake, and we're going to have to fix it before it reaches Gareth. Because if Gareth thinks the marriage plan has failed, it isn't only Adrian's life that becomes forfeit. It's ours." The lunch with Sebastian was, as Coraline had promised, the hardest performance of my life, and I want to describe it because it was the moment I learned that the mask I'd worn my whole life out of pain could be worn instead as a blade. We met at the kind of restaurant where the Ashfords are known and coddled, and Sebastian was radiant, expansive, the golden brother finally deigning to notice the runt of the litter, and every warm word out of his mouth was a probe, a careful test, a hook cast to see what I'd bite. And I gave him nothing but the fool. I gushed about the wedding. I confided, shyly, that Coraline and I were getting along, that maybe, fully, I'd found somewhere I belonged. I let him see a lonely man pathetically grateful for his brother's attention, and I watched Sebastian relax degree by degree, watched the tension leave his shoulders as he concluded, exactly as we'd planned, that his idiot brother knew nothing, and suspected nothing, and was simply too stupid and too starved for affection to be a threat. There was one moment at that lunch when I nearly lost everything, and I want to describe it because it taught me how thin the ice is when you are performing for a predator. Halfway through the meal, Sebastian leaned back, swirling his wine, and said, casually, far too casually, "Odd thing, the night of your wedding. Some of Father's people were in the area, apparently, and there was a disturbance up at the Vorn place. Nothing came of it. You didn't hear anything strange that night, did you? Nothing that woke you? And my whole body went cold, because there it was, the real question, the only question, delivered lightly over a glass of wine by a man who wanted to know whether his brother had survived a murder he'd helped arrange. And I felt, for one lethal half-second, the pull to lie too hard, to protest too much, to say no, nothing, absolutely nothing, which is exactly what a guilty man says, and exactly what would have told Sebastian everything. Coraline had drilled me for this. Never deny more than you're asked. A fool doesn't manage the truth. A fool blunders through it. So I made myself laugh, and I said, with the wounded embarrassment of a man confessing something humiliating, God, Sebastian, I slept like the dead. I'd had 4 glasses of that champagne because I was terrified, and I passed out cold before midnight, on my own wedding night, in a chair. Coraline hasn't let me forget it. You can imagine what that did for my dignity. And I watched my brother's face, and I watched the question die, because I had given him something better than a denial. I had given him a humiliation. And a man's willingness to humiliate himself is the most convincing proof of honesty there is. And Sebastian laughed, delighted at the image of his brother the fool passed out drunk and useless on his wedding night, and he never asked again. That was Coraline's teaching, and it saved my life at that table. And I sat there while my brother laughed at me, and I thought about the boy he'd been, the boy who once held my head under the water in the lake at the summer house until I saw black spots, and then pulled me up and told our father I'd slipped, and how father had said, without even looking up, Adrian, do try not to be so clumsy. And I understood that the man across from me had been drowning me my whole life, in one way or another, and that everyone had always called it clumsiness on my part. I'm glad, Adrian, he said toward the end, and he even sounded like he meant it, which was the most chilling part, because I understood that Sebastian could look at a brother he'd helped mark for death and feel a genuine flicker of warmth, that the cruelty and the affection lived side by side in him without the slightest friction. And I thought of Coraline's words about her uncle, about people for whom warmth and murder do not contradict, and I understood I was sitting across from one. You always did just want to belong, Sebastian said, patting my hand. Maybe the witch is good for you after all. And I smiled, and I thanked him, and inside me, the cold, clean fury banked itself a little hotter, and I thought, you have no idea, brother, what she's good for. While I was losing to Sebastian on purpose, Coraline was in his office, and what she found there was the first hard proof that her 2-year theory was true. Sebastian, it turned out, was careless in the specific way of men who have never once been meaningfully opposed. And in a locked drawer that took Coraline's people 90 seconds to open, there were records, communications, a pattern of contact between the Ashford holdings and an entity Coraline recognized instantly, a private fund domiciled offshore that she had spent 2 years trying to see the bottom of, because it was the same fund her Uncle Gareth had been bleeding the Vorn assets into for a decade. The same fund. Ashford money and Vorn money, the fortunes of 2 clans locked in an ancient public feud, flowing quietly into the same offshore vessel, mingling, pooling, growing, controlled by, when Coraline finally traced the ownership all the way down that night, a structure whose 2 ultimate beneficiaries were Arthur Caldwell and Gareth Shaw. Partners, not enemies, partners. The feud was theater. It had always been theater. 2 old men who ran 2 great houses had figured out, years ago, that the most profitable thing they could do was pretend to hate each other. Because a feud justified everything, justified secrecy, justified armed men and off-books operations and sudden convenient deaths, justified moving enormous sums into unaccountable places under the cover of protecting each house from the other, when in truth, both houses were being quietly hollowed out and their wealth funneled into a single shared vessel that the 2 patriarchs would, when the time came, walk away with, leaving both clans' heirs to inherit debt and blame and ashes. In the marriage, our marriage, the great gesture of peace, had been the beginning of the endgame, a way to bring the 2 inconvenient children together to die, to trigger the assets to flow, to give the feud one last bloody act before both old men vanished with everything. It's worse than I thought, Coraline said that night, spreading the office documents beside her own 2 years of evidence. The 2 halves of the puzzle finally joined on the table between us. I thought your father and my uncle were connected. I didn't understand they were the same operation. Adrian, this isn't 2 families with a shared corruption. This is one conspiracy wearing 2 family names, and everyone else in both clans, your brother, your sister, my cousins, all of them, are either pawns who think they're players or players who think they're safe, and not one of them understands that the two men at the top are planning to leave every last one of them holding the wreckage. I looked at the joined evidence, the shape of a lie 17 years deep, and I thought about my mother. My mother knew, I said quietly. Didn't she? That's what she was afraid of. She saw the direction the family was moving. She saw my father becoming this, and she was going to do something about it, and that's why she died. We don't know that yet, Coraline said, but gently, because we both knew that we did. Which is why we're going to the docks tomorrow. Carefully. We went to the docks the next evening, in a plain car, dressed like no one, because a woman the whole city called a witch, and a man the whole city thought was a fool, had learned that being underestimated was its own kind of invisibility. Silas Croft met us in a dim office above a warehouse that smelled of salt and rust and rope, and he was older than I remembered, stooped and gray, but his eyes when he saw me filled with a warmth I hadn't felt directed at me since my mother died. He took my hands in both of his, and he looked at me for a long moment, and he said, "You have her eyes. You always did. She'd be so proud of you, and so afraid for you, both at once, the way she always was." And then he looked at Coraline, at the cursed witch of the enemy clan standing in his little office, and instead of fear, his weathered face showed something like relief, and he said, "And you brought a Vorn." Good. Your mother always said the feud was the lie at the center of everything. She said the day in Ashford and a Vorn finally saw through it together would be the day the truth had a chance. I didn't understand her. I think maybe you two are what she meant. I felt my throat close. "Silas," I said, "how did my mother die?" And Silas Croft was quiet for a long moment, and then he went to a battered safe in the corner of that little office, a safe that had sat unremarkable in a warehouse for 17 years, precisely because no one would ever think to look for anything important in the possession of a demoted old driver, and he took out a package wrapped in oilcloth, and he set it on the desk with hands that trembled slightly. "Your mother gave me this the week before she died," he said. "She told me to keep it safe, and to give it to you, and only when you were finally strong enough to use it and not just be destroyed by it. For 17 years I've watched them keep you small, and I feared that day would never come. But you married the truth, boy. You married the one person your father never counted on. So maybe it's come at last." He pushed the package toward me. "Your mother didn't die of her heart, Adrian. Your mother found out what your father and Gareth Shaw were building, and she gathered proof, and she was going to take it to the authorities and to the honest members of both families and blow the whole thing apart before it could grow. And your father found out. And a week later, she was dead of a sudden illness, and I have spent 17 years grieving a woman I know was murdered and holding the proof she died for, waiting for a hand strong enough to take it. It's yours now. It was always meant to be yours. God help you both, because the moment you open that, there's no more hiding, and the men who killed your mother will kill anyone to keep what's in it buried." I looked at the oilcloth package that held my mother's murder and my family's truth, and I felt Coraline's hand come to rest on my shoulder, steady and warm. And I understood that everything until this moment had been the prologue, and that whatever was wrapped in that cloth was the beginning of the real war. And far across the city, my father sat with a glass of 40-year-old scotch and listened to Sebastian report that Adrian was harmless, that Adrian knew nothing, that Adrian was simply the fool he'd always been. And Arthur Caldwell almost let himself believe it. And then some old instinct, the instinct that had kept him at the top of a nest of vipers for 40 years, made him set down his glass and say, "Find out if anyone has been to see Silas Croft, the old driver, your mother's man." And Sebastian frowned and said, "Wren? He's nobody. He's been rotting at the docks for years." And my father looked into the fire and said, softly, "Your mother's people are never nobody. That's the mistake I almost made once before, a long time ago, and it cost me more than you know. Find out. Tonight." We opened my mother's package that night, back at the Vorn estate, in the study Coraline had made our war room, and it was everything Silas had promised and worse. My mother had been thorough in the way that only a frightened person with everything to lose can be. There were ledgers, photographs, letters, a handwritten account in her own careful hand of exactly what she had discovered. The early architecture of the same conspiracy Coraline and I had spent the week uncovering, but documented 17 years ago, in its infancy, by the one person who had seen it coming. Reading my mother's handwriting was the hardest thing I have ever done. It was her voice, preserved, describing her growing horror as she realized what her husband was becoming, what he and Gareth Shaw were building, the fake feud they were engineering, the fortunes they intended to steal, the people they were already willing to hurt. And at the end, in a final letter addressed to no one and everyone, she had written a sentence that I will carry until I die. If you are reading this, then I was right, and it cost me. And I am sorry I could not stay to protect you, but I have left you the truth, and the truth, in the right hands, is the only weapon that has ever frightened men like your father. Be brave, my darling. Be brave, and do not be alone. The mistake I made was trying to fight them by myself. Find someone they cannot buy and cannot break, and fight them together, because a lie this large can survive one honest person, but it cannot survive two who trust each other completely. I read that last line out loud, and my voice broke, and Coraline Shaw, the cursed witch, the woman I'd been married to for 8 days, crossed the room and put her arms around me while I wept for a mother murdered 17 years ago for the crime of seeing clearly, and it was the first time anyone had held me since I was 9 years old. We stood like that for a long time, and when I finally pulled back and looked at her, at this severe, brilliant woman the whole world had taught me to fear, I understood that my mother's last instruction had already impossibly been fulfilled. Find someone they cannot buy and cannot break, and fight them together. I had. My father had handed her to me himself, thinking he was handing me a murderer, and instead, he'd handed me the exact ally my dying mother had told me to find. It was the cruelest joke and the greatest gift, and it had come from the same source, which is, I've learned, how the best things in a life like mine usually arrive. Your mother was right, Coraline said quietly, still close, her hand on my arm. A lie this large can't survive two people who trust each other completely. So, she looked up at me, and there was something in her dark eyes I hadn't seen before, a question underneath the strategy. Do we trust each other completely, Adrian? Because I've spent 10 years unable to fully trust another living soul, and I need to know, before we walk any further into this, whether you and I are actually the two your mother meant, or whether we're just two frightened people using each other for a little while. Because I don't think I can do the second one. Not with you. I've realized, this week, that I don't want to. And I looked at Coraline Shaw, and I said the truest thing I have ever said. Completely, I said. You're the first person since my mother who's told me the truth even when it hurt, who's treated me like I'm capable instead of like I'm broken, who looked at the family failure and saw someone worth fighting beside. I don't know what this marriage was supposed to be, but I know what it's become. It's the only real thing in my life, and you're the only real person in it. And yes, Coraline, completely, all the way to the end, whatever the end is. Something in her face came undone, some 10-year-old armor finally setting itself down, and for a moment, the monster and the disappointment just looked at each other in the lamplight. Two people who had each been alone their whole lives, no longer alone. And then, because we were who we were, because a tender moment in the middle of a war is a luxury that gets people killed, Coraline's phone rang, and the moment shattered, because it was one of her people at the docks, and his voice was tight with urgency. Ashford men, he said. 4 cars, heading for the warehouse district. They're going for the old man. My blood turned to ice. My father had moved faster than we'd feared. Sebastian had checked, as my father ordered, and found the trail, my visit to Silas, the one loose thread, and my father, who had murdered my mother 17 years ago precisely by eliminating the people she trusted, was doing the exact same thing again, tying off the exact same kind of thread, and if we did not move now, Silas Croft, the last person who had loved my mother, the man who had protected her truth for 17 years, was going to die tonight for the crime of finally handing it to me. What happened next was the first time I understood that I was not going to be a bystander in this war, that Coraline had been right, that there was something underneath the disappointment that my family should have been afraid of, because I did not freeze, and I did not defer, and I did not wait for Coraline to handle it. I stood up and I said, "How fast can your people get to the docks?" And Coraline said, "Not fast enough. They're 20 minutes out. The Ashford men are closer." And I said, "Then we go now. We're only 15 minutes from the docks if we take the cliff road. And we call Silas on the way and get him moving." And Coraline looked at me, and I watched her decide to trust the disappointment with something that mattered. And she grabbed the car keys and said, "Then drive like you mean it, husband." And we ran. The cliff road at night is a black ribbon over a 200-foot drop, and I drove it faster than I had any right to, while Coraline called Silas and told him, calm and clear, to leave the warehouse now, out the back, toward the fish market, don't pack, don't hesitate, just go. And I could hear the old man's frightened breathing on the line as he moved, and I could hear, behind him, faintly, the sound of cars arriving, doors slamming, and I pressed the accelerator until the engine screamed and the cliff blurred past and Coraline said, "Adrian, the road." And I said, "I know the road. I've been driving away from that family my whole life. I know exactly how to run." And something that was almost a laugh escaped her even then, even in the terror, and we came down off the cliff road into the warehouse district, doing twice the legal speed with an old man's life in the balance. We reached the fish market as the Ashford men reached the warehouse, and in the chaos of a working dock at night, the shouting, the running, the confusion, we found Silas Croft stumbling toward us between the stalls, terrified but alive. And I threw open the door and hauled him into the back seat, and Coraline was already reversing before the door was closed. And behind us, I saw men in dark coats spilling out of the warehouse, too late, scanning the crowd for an old man who was already gone. And I understood that we had beaten my father by 90 seconds, and that 90 seconds was the difference between Silas living and my mother's death repeating itself 17 years later. We got him out. We got him safe, to one of Coraline's protected places. And as I helped the shaking old man inside, he gripped my arm and said, "She'd be so proud. Not that you saved me, that you didn't run when it was your family doing the chasing. She always feared you'd inherited her heart, but not her spine. She'd be so glad to be wrong." And across the city, in the Ashford mansion, Sebastian delivered the news that the old driver had slipped the net, that someone had warned him, that a fast car had pulled him out 90 seconds ahead of the team, and Arthur Caldwell stood at his window, looking out at the city he'd bled for 40 years, and for the first time, a real unease moved through him, because a harmless fool does not orchestrate a 90-second rescue on the cliff road, and a cursed witch does not risk herself for an Ashford servant, and the two facts together spelled a word my father had refused to consider until that moment. Alliance. "The witch has him," he said slowly. "Not as a victim, as a partner. My God, they've actually—" He turned from the window, and his old face had gone hard and cold and frightened all at once. "Get me Gareth, on the secure line, now. Because if those two have found each other, and if that old man gave the boy what I think he gave him, then the thing we buried 17 years ago is about to come out of the ground. And we are all of us, every one, in a great deal more danger than we understood." The two old men met the next night, and Coraline knew about it before it happened, because Coraline had spent 10 years learning the movements of her Uncle Gareth the way a prisoner learns the schedule of the guards. They met, as they always had, under the cover of the feud, in a neutral location, two patriarchs pretending to negotiate their family's endless quarrel, while in truth, coordinating the operation that had made them both quietly, obscenely rich. And this time, Coraline's people were listening, because Coraline had spent 2 years placing the means to listen, and so we heard it. The two architects of 17 years of lies, speaking plainly at last. "The boy is a problem," my father said, his voice tinny over the recording but unmistakable. "He's found the witch, or she's found him, and I think the old driver gave him Isolde's package." Isolde. My mother's name, in my father's mouth, flat and cold, a problem being discussed. "You told me the package was destroyed," Gareth Shaw said, and his voice was smoother than my father's, colder, the voice of a man who had spent a decade poisoning a city against his own niece. "I told you Isolde was handled," my father said. "The package I could never find. She was cleverer than I gave her credit for, right up to the end. It seems she left it with someone I overlooked, and now, 17 years later, it surfaced in the worst possible hands." "Then we accelerate," Gareth said, and there was no hesitation in him at all, which told me everything I needed to know about the man Coraline had grown up under. "The old man, my father, is failing faster than expected. The doctors give him weeks. Once he's gone, and the succession is finalized in my favor, the Vorn assets are mine to move freely. And there's nothing your boy and my niece can prove that matters, because a scandal about two clans that no longer have honest leadership to appeal to is just noise. So we finish it. Your father's estate liquidates on schedule. My father dies, conveniently, before he can be reached by anyone carrying Isolde's package or Coraline's poison. And the two children." A pause. "The two children have an accident. Together. The tragic newlyweds. It writes itself. And this time, Arthur, we don't hire cut-rate contractors and leave threads. This time we use my people, and we do it properly, and we do it soon, because a lie only has to hold for a few more weeks, and then it won't matter what anyone knows, because there'll be no one left with the standing to do anything about it." I turned off the recording. The war room was silent, and I looked at Coraline, and I saw, for the first time since I'd met her, real fear in her face. Not for herself. I would learn she almost never feared for herself, but for someone else. "My grandfather," she said. "Gareth's going to kill my grandfather. Soon. Before he can be reached. Adrian, my grandfather is the one person in the Vorn family whose word still carries absolute weight. The founding patriarch. the man who is going to name me heir before the stroke. If we could reach him, if we could get Isolde's package and my 2 years of evidence in front of him, while he still has the standing to act on it, he could denounce Gareth with a legitimacy no one could challenge. He could name me heir on the record. He could split the Vorn clan away from Gareth and give us the one thing we desperately need, which is a great house with honest leadership willing to stand behind the truth. But he's dying, and Gareth controls his care, controls his access, controls the doctors. And the moment Gareth believes we might reach him, he'll simply let my grandfather die a little sooner. We have weeks, maybe, and they've just become days, and I don't know how to get past Gareth to my own dying grandfather. I looked at my wife, at this brilliant woman who had planned 3 moves ahead of everyone for 2 years, and had just, for the first time, hit a wall. And I understood that this was the moment I stopped being the junior partner in our war, because this was the exact kind of problem I was uniquely built to solve. You can't get past Gareth, I said slowly, an idea assembling itself. Because Gareth is watching for the witch. He spent 10 years making sure the whole Vorn world is watching for you, waiting for you to make a move on the old man, primed to see your every approach as an attack. You're the most watched person in that family. But Coraline, I felt the plan click into place, clean and cold and perfect. I'm not. I'm an Ashford. I'm your husband. And to the Vorn family, to the doctors, to the staff, to Gareth himself, I am exactly what everyone has always thought I am, a harmless fool, the disappointment they married to their monster as a joke. Nobody is watching me. Nobody has ever watched me. That's been the tragedy of my whole life, and it's about to become the most valuable thing I own. Gareth's guarding the front door against the witch he fears. He's not going to think twice about the fool she married wandering in to pay respects to his wife's grandfather. Send the witch, and the walls go up. Send the fool. I smiled, and I felt my mother's spine in me at last, and I walked right through the front door. Coraline stared at me, and then, slowly, the fear left her face and was replaced by something I would spend the rest of my life trying to earn again. A look of pure, startled admiration. You'd have to do it alone, she said. I couldn't come. My presence would trigger exactly what we're trying to avoid. You'd be walking into Gareth's stronghold, past his people, to reach a dying man, with nothing protecting you but the fact that everyone underestimates you. And if they stop underestimating you for 1 second, Adrian, you don't come out. I've spent 26 years being underestimated, I said. It's the only skill I have. Let me finally use it for something. And Coraline Shaw crossed the room, and she took my face in both her hands, and she kissed me, fierce and sudden and real. Our first real kiss, not a performance for cameras, but a thing that came from somewhere deep and frightened and alive. And when she pulled back, her eyes were bright, and her voice was rough. Come back, she said. That's an order, husband. I spent 10 years alone, and I have just decided I'm done with it. So you are going to walk into my uncle's stronghold and charm a dying old man and walk back out. And you are going to come back to me, because I did not survive being turned into a monster just to lose the first person who ever saw past it. Do you understand me? I understand you, I said, and I meant it, and I kissed her again. And that night, as we planned my walk into the lion's den, something that had started as a partnership of desperation finished becoming the thing my mother had prayed for me to find. 2 people they could not buy and could not break, who trusted each other completely. I want to tell you about the nights, because a war is not only the operations, it is also the hours in between, and it was in those hours that Coraline Shaw and I stopped being partners of necessity and became something neither of us had planned. We fell into a rhythm, in that great dark house, over those weeks. She did not sleep much, and neither did I, and so we ended most nights in the war room together, and somewhere along the way, the war room became the warmest place either of us had ever known. Which is a strange thing to say about a room where we planned the destruction of 2 families, but it's true, because it was the first room in either of our lives where we were fully ourselves and fully safe at the same time. She taught me to see the way she saw, the whole board at once, and I taught her something too, though it took me a while to understand what. One night, deep in the planning, frustrated by a piece that wouldn't fit, she said, "Why would your father keep a servant like Silas alive and loyal for 30 years if he's the kind of man who murders anyone inconvenient?" It doesn't fit my model, and I said, because your model doesn't have room for the possibility that people are loyal for reasons that aren't strategic. That Silas stayed because he loved my mother, not because it was smart. And my father kept him because a loyal old driver was beneath his notice. And you keep missing the people at the bottom, Coraline, because you were raised at the top. And the top can't see the bottom, that's its great blindness. and it's why the men we're fighting never see the people who'll bring them down." And she went very quiet, and then she said slowly, "You just found a hole in a model I've been refining for 10 years. And she looked at me like she was seeing something new, and I understood that I had something to offer her too. That the gentleness my family had mocked was actually a kind of sight, an ability to see the people power renders invisible, and that between her view from the top and my view from the bottom, we could see the whole thing, all of it, in a way neither of us could alone. That was the night I stopped feeling like the junior partner. We cooked together too, which sounds absurd, two people plotting a war in a professional kitchen at 2 in the morning, but Coraline, it turned out, had never once cooked anything in her life, had grown up with staff for everything, and I, the disappointment, had learned to cook as a boy because the kitchen was the one place in the Ashford house where the staff were kind to me. And so I taught the cursed witch of the Thorne clan to make my mother's soup. And I will never forget the sight of her, this severe, brilliant, terrifying woman, frowning in fierce concentration over a pot of broth as if it were a hostile takeover, and burning it, badly, the first 3 times, and refusing to give up, because Coraline Shaw did not accept defeat from anything, least of all a soup. And the night she finally got it right, she was so absurdly, unguardedly pleased that she laughed, really laughed. And I realized I had never heard her laugh before, and that I would do a great many dangerous things to hear it again. She told me things, in those nights, that she'd never told anyone. About her mother. About the 10 years of being alone. About the specific loneliness of being feared, which is worse, she said, than being hated, because hatred is at least a kind of attention, but fear is a wall. Fear means no one ever comes close enough to know you, and she had spent a decade behind that wall, and she had told herself she preferred it, safer, cleaner, and she had believed it right up until a gentle fool moved into her house and refused to be afraid of her. "You're the first person in 10 years, she said one night, not looking at me, stirring the soup she'd finally learned to make, who looked at the witch and just kept looking. Everyone else looks away. They've always looked away, my whole life, since I was 14. And you looked at the folder full of your own death, and then you looked up at me and asked me why, and there was no fear in it, only curiosity. And I don't know how to say this, Adrian. I'm not built to say this. But you looked at me like I was a person, and I had genuinely forgotten, that I was one. And I put down what I was holding, and I crossed the kitchen, and I took her hand, the one not holding the spoon, and I said, 'You're the most alive person I've ever met.' They didn't turn you into a monster, Coraline. They turned you into a survivor. And then they told the world that survival was monstrousness, because a survivor was the one thing they couldn't control. I don't see a witch when I look at you. I never did. I see the only person who ever told me the truth." And she set down the spoon, and she looked at me, and 10 years of wall came down in her dark eyes, and neither of us said anything else for a while. And that was the night, I think, though we never marked it, that a marriage arranged to kill us both quietly became the realest thing either of us would ever have. Meanwhile, in the Ashford mansion, my sister Genevieve was beginning, very quietly, to be afraid. Not of Adrian, she still thought me a fool. She was afraid of a conversation she had overheard, a fragment of her father on the secure line, discussing an acceleration, an endgame, a liquidation, and Genevieve Sterling, who was cleverer than everyone gave her credit for, including her own father, had done the arithmetic that Coraline had done days before, and had realized, with a cold, slow horror, that the liquidation her father was planning did not seem to have a place in it for her. She had been so certain she was a player. She was beginning to suspect she was a pawn. And a pawn who realizes the game, Coraline would later tell me, is the most dangerous piece on the board, because a pawn has nothing to lose and knows exactly where the king keeps his secrets. But that was later. That night, Genevieve only sat alone with her fear and looked at the phone she'd used to order her own brother's death, and wondered, for the first time in her life, whether she had been the huntress all along, or whether someone had simply handed her the knife and pointed her at the family disappointment to keep her busy while the real slaughter was arranged above her head. I walked into Gareth Shaw's stronghold 2 days later, through the front door, exactly as I'd said I would, and it was the most frightening and the most exhilarating thing I had ever done, because I did it wearing the disguise I'd worn my whole life, and for the first time, it was a choice. The old Thorne patriarch, Coraline's grandfather, was dying in the family's ancestral house on the North Cliffs, a grim old fortress of a place that Gareth had turned, over 10 years, into a gilded prison for the man who'd built the family's fortune. And I simply arrived, the Ashford son, the new husband, come to pay his respects to his wife's grandfather, and I brought flowers, and I brought a card, and I brought a wide, nervous, harmless smile, and I made myself small and awkward and eager to please in exactly the way everyone expected, and I watched the Vorn security look at me and dismiss me in the same glance, because I was not the witch. I was just the fool she'd married, and what harm could the fool possibly do? Coraline had briefed me on every face, every camera, every routine. 2 years of intelligence poured into my head, and I moved through that hostile house like a man who belonged there and mattered to no one, which, it turned out, is the most invisible thing a person can be. I got lost, on purpose, twice, playing the confused son-in-law, and each wrong turn took me exactly where I needed to go. And I charmed a nervous young nurse with genuine kindness, because kindness was the one weapon I'd always had and never valued. And she, who was frightened of Gareth and grateful for a gentle word, let slip the one thing I needed. That the old man had lucid hours in the early morning before his medication was adjusted, and that his room was on the 3rd floor, and that his door was watched, but his window opened onto a service balcony that the guards forgot about. I did not need the window. I did something better. I waited until the household's attention was on the evening's activity, and then I simply walked up to the guard at the old man's door, the harmless fool, and I said, warmly, "I know it's late, but I brought these all the way up and I'd hate for them to wilt. Could I just set them by his bed? I won't wake him, I promise. My wife would never forgive me if I didn't at least try." And I held up the flowers with the pathetic, hopeful expression of a man who has never once been a threat to anyone. And the guard, who had been told to watch for the witch and her poison, looked at the flowers and the fool and made the calculation everyone always made, and he let me in. And then I was alone with the dying founder of the Vorn clan, and I set down the flowers, and I sat by his bed, and I waited. And a little after midnight the old man's eyes opened, and they were, in that lucid hour, sharp and clear and terribly aware. The eyes of the man who had built an empire and then watched his own son turn it into a machine for eating his family. "You're not one of mine," he said, his voice a dry whisper. "Too gentle. My blood doesn't grow gentle. Who are you?" "My name is Adrian Thorne," I said quietly. "I married your granddaughter, Coraline, and I've come to tell you the truth about what's happening to your family and your fortune and to her, and to ask you to help us stop it before you die, because you're the only person in this city with the standing to do it, and Gareth is going to make sure you die before you can." The old man's eyes sharpened further, and something moved in them, grief and fury and a terrible dawning clarity. "Coraline," he whispered. "They told me she'd gone mad, that she was dangerous, that she turned against the family. Gareth told me, the doctors told me, everyone." "Everyone lied to you," I said, and I took out the evidence, my mother's package and Coraline's 2 years, and I laid it out on the dying man's bed in the lamplight, and I told him everything, quietly, urgently, watching the door, and the old patriarch of the Vorn clan read the destruction of his life's work in his own son's hand, and I watched him understand, at the very end of everything, that the granddaughter he'd loved had been telling the truth for 10 years, and he'd let them convince him she was a monster. "My son," he breathed when I finished. "Gareth. He did all this. He turned me against Coraline so I couldn't name her. He's bleeding the family. He killed. He's going to kill me." His frail hand gripped mine with sudden ferocious strength. "Your mother, Isolde Caldwell. I knew her. She came to me once, years ago before she died, tried to warn me that Arthur and Gareth were working together. And I didn't believe her either, God forgive me. I sent her away, and a week later she was dead, and I told myself it was coincidence." Tears stood in the old man's eyes. "I have been a fool, guarded by monsters for 10 years, and it has cost me everything. And now a gentle boy Arthur threw away has walked past all of them to tell me the truth my own son buried. All right." His grip tightened. "All right. If I'm dying, and I am, then let me do one true thing before I go. What do you need from me, boy? Quickly, while my mind is still my own." "3 things," I said, and I'd rehearse this with Coraline until I could say it in my sleep. "A statement, recorded, in your own voice, denouncing Gareth and detailing what he's done, while you're lucid and it can't be dismissed. A signed instrument naming Coraline as your true heir and successor, restoring her standing, so that when you're gone, the honest members of the Vorn family have someone legitimate to rally behind instead of Gareth. And your seal, your authority. Something that proves to the Vorn loyalists that Coraline speaks with your blessing, because a great house doesn't follow evidence, it follows legitimacy, and you're the only one who can give it to her." The old man laughed, a dry, terrible sound. "Arthur thinks he's so clever," he whispered. He married his gentle son to my granddaughter to have them both killed. And instead, he sent the one person who could reach me past my son's walls. There's a justice in that. Get me the recorder, get me a pen, and get me my grandfather's seal, boy. It's in the safe behind the painting. The combination is my late wife's birthday, the 6th of March, 1941. Gareth never knew it because Gareth never once asked me about the woman I loved. Quickly now. My clear hours are short, and my son's people are thorough. Before I did any of it, though, the old man gripped my hand and made me stop, and he said something I have never told Coraline in full. Because some things a person should hear only once, and I gave it to her once and it undid her. But I'll tell you. You love her, the old patriarch said, studying my face in the lamplight with those last clear eyes. The gentle Ashford boy loves my monster granddaughter. I can see it. Don't bother denying it. I've spent 70 years reading faces, and yours is an open book. I do, I said. I love her. And the old man's eyes filled, and he said, then let me tell you something to give her, because I won't live to say it myself, and I said it wrong to her once, and let 10 years pass without correcting it, and that is my great shame. Tell her, his voice shook, tell her that her grandfather knew. At the end, with a clear mind, tell her I knew she was never the monster they made her. Tell her I was old and sick, and I let her uncle's poison in, and it is the worst thing I ever did, worse than any deal, to let them convince me that my Coraline, my brave, clever girl, the only one of my blood worth a damn, had gone bad. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I named her heir not as strategy, but as apology, because she was always my heir, in my heart, from the day she was a child asking questions no one else dared ask. And I let them take that from her, and I am giving it back with the last hour of my life, and it is not enough. It will never be enough. But tell her the old man knew, at the end, and died proud of her, and died sorry. I promised him I would. And later, when it was all over, I sat with Coraline, and I gave her, word for word, her grandfather's last message. And I watched 10 years of a wound she'd told herself had healed break open, and finally, properly, bleed. And she wept in a way I had never seen her weep. Not the controlled grief she allowed herself, but the raw thing underneath. The 14-year-old girl who'd lost her mother, and then lost her grandfather's belief, and had been alone with both losses for a decade. And she said, through it, he knew. He knew at the end. That's all I ever wanted, Adrian, in 10 years, the only thing, was for one of them to know I wasn't what they said. And I held her, and I understood that I had carried out of that stronghold something far more valuable than a seal or a recording. I had carried an old man's apology to a granddaughter who'd needed it for a decade, and that if I had done nothing else in the whole war, that alone would have made it worth the risk. But that was later. In the room, with the clock running and Gareth's people thorough, I did all of it, that night, in the space of a stolen hour, with my heart in my throat and my ears straining at every sound in the corridor. I recorded the old patriarch's denunciation of his own son, his voice thin but absolutely clear, naming Gareth's crimes one by one. I helped him sign, in a shaking hand, the instrument that restored Coraline as heir of the Thorne clan. And I opened the safe behind the painting with a dead woman's birthday, and took out the ancient seal of the Thorne founders, heavy and cold in my hand, the physical symbol of a legitimacy Gareth had spent 10 years trying to steal. And just as I closed the safe, I heard it. Footsteps in the corridor, unhurried, confident, and the old man's eyes went wide with warning, and a voice I recognized from the recordings, smooth and cold and amused, spoke from just outside the door. You know, said Gareth Shaw, the strangest thing, my people told me the Ashford fool came to leave flowers an hour ago, and I thought nothing of it. And then I thought, an hour is a very long time to leave flowers. The door handle began to turn. So I've come to see for myself exactly what kind of fool spends an hour alone with a dying man. Let's have a look at you, boy. And the door opened, and I stood there in the lamplight, with the evidence in my coat and the seal in my hand, and the recording still warm, face to face with the man who had spent 10 years turning my wife into a monster, and who was, at that very moment, calculating exactly how to make sure I never left that room alive. I did the only thing that could have saved me. I became the fool one more time, and I made it the performance of my life. Oh, I said, and I let my face crumple into flustered, harmless embarrassment, and I fumbled the flowers I'd left by the bed, knocking them over, babbling. I'm so sorry, I know I've been ages. I got to talking, well, he was talking mostly, in and out. You know how it is at this stage. And I couldn't bring myself to just leave. It felt so rude. And Coraline would want me to sit with him, She loves him so. And I got a bit lost finding my way, and then I didn't want to wake him, and… I'm rambling, aren't I? I'm sorry, you must be family. I'm Adrian, Coraline's husband, the Ashford one. And I stuck out my hand, the one not holding the seal hidden in my coat, and I beamed at Gareth Shaw with the wide, anxious eagerness of a man desperate to be liked and utterly incapable of being a threat. And I watched the most dangerous man in the Thorne family look at me and perform, in real time, the exact calculation that everyone had performed my whole life. Was this a threat? No. This was the disappointment. This was the joke. This was Arthur Caldwell's failure son, exactly as advertised, flustered and harmless and pathetically eager. I could see Gareth want to believe it, because it fit everything he knew, and I made it so easy to believe. I made myself so small and so silly that against every instinct the man had, the fool won. But not completely. Gareth was not my father's partner for nothing. He shook my hand and he smiled, cold and smooth, and he said, "Of course, the husband. How thoughtful of you to sit with him. He gets confused, you understand, at the end. Says all sorts of things that aren't true. I hope he didn't upset you with any of his ramblings." A test, delivered gently, a hook to see if I'd bite, if I'd reveal that the old man had told me anything worth knowing. And I gave him the fool's answer, the perfect answer. "Oh, he wasn't making much sense," I said cheerfully, sadly. "Kept calling me by other names, talked about his wife a lot. It was sweet, really, and a bit sad. I don't think he knew who I was, honestly." And I watched Gareth relax, that final fraction, because a boy who'd been told the truth would never describe it as an old man not making sense. And Gareth escorted me out himself, all courtesy, walking me to the door, and the whole way I babbled pleasantly about nothing, while the ancient seal of his family sat cold against my ribs, and the recording of his own father denouncing him sat warm in my pocket, and Gareth Shaw shook my hand at the door and thanked me for my thoughtfulness and sent the fool home, and never once knew that he had just personally escorted the ruin of his entire life out his own front gate. I did not breathe until I was 2 miles away, and then I pulled over on the cliff road, in the dark, and I shook, and I laughed, and I cried a little, all at once, and I called Coraline, and when she answered, before I could say anything, her voice cracked with a fear she'd been holding for hours. "Adrian, tell me you're out. Tell me you're alive." "I'm out," I said. "I'm alive. Coraline, I have all of it. The recording, the instrument, the seal, all of it." He walked me to the door himself. Your uncle walked me out his own front door with his father's denunciation in my pocket, and never knew. The line was silent for a moment, and then I heard my wife, the cursed witch, the woman who had been alone for 10 years, make a sound that was half a laugh and half a sob, and she said, "You impossible man. You beautiful, impossible, underestimated man. Come home. Come home right now. I need to see with my own eyes that you're real." I came home. And what waited for me at home was Coraline standing in the doorway of the great dark house on the cliffs. And she didn't say anything, she just crossed the distance between us and held me so hard it hurt. And I held her back. And we stood there in the doorway of the house where I was supposed to die. 2 people who had each been thrown away, no longer alone. And I understood that whatever happened next, whatever it cost, I had already won the only thing that had ever mattered, which was this: someone who needed me to come home. The old patriarch died 4 days later. Gareth did not wait. The moment the doctors reported the old man had entered his final decline, Gareth, I have no doubt, hastened it. And Coraline's grandfather, the founder of the Thorne clan, the man who had spent one last lucid hour doing one true thing, slipped away in the night. And Gareth Shaw moved immediately to finalize his control of the family, exactly as he'd planned. Except that this time, the old man had not died silently. This time, in a safe in the Thorne estate, and in copies in 3 secure locations, there was his recorded voice, and his signature, and his seal, waiting. Coraline grieved him hard, and I held her through it. And then she wiped her eyes and became, again, the woman who thought 3 moves ahead. Because grief, she told me, is a luxury you take out on loan and pay back after the war. He gave us the last piece, she said, laying the grandfather's instruments alongside everything else, the whole devastating archive we'd assembled. We have my grandfather denouncing Gareth. We have me named as legitimate heir. We have the seal that proves the Thorne loyalists should follow me. We have your mother's package documenting the conspiracy at its birth. We have the office records proving the shared fund. We have 3 assassins on record naming your sister. And we have my 2 years tying all of it together. It is, Adrian, the most complete case against two great houses that has ever existed. And it's completely useless right now. I blinked. Useless? We have everything. We have everything and no one to give it to, she said grimly. That's the trap men like your father and my uncle build. You think the answer to a crime is the police, the courts, the law? But they own the police, Adrian. Not all of them, but enough. They own judges, they own the commissioner, they own the men who decide which cases get investigated and which evidence gets lost. If we hand this to the authorities they've bought will bury it, and warn them, and we'll be dead within the week, and the evidence will vanish, and it will all have been for nothing. My grandfather learned that. Your mother learned that, fatally. The law is not a weapon we can use, because they got to the law first. So we can't go to the authorities. We have to go around them. We have to take this to the one court they can't buy and can't bury. Which is? She looked at me, and her dark eyes gleamed with the cold brilliance I had come to love. All of them, she said. Everyone. The whole city at once. Both families have their power because both families are trusted, respected, believed. The great houses of Ashcroft, pillars of the community. That trust is the foundation everything else stands on. The banks, the partners, the officials, the loyalists in both clans. So we don't indict them in a courtroom they own. We indict them in front of everyone they've ever needed to believe in them, all at the same time, in a way that can't be suppressed, can't be spun, can't be buried. Because 10,000 people saw it happen live. We wait for the one event where all of Ashcroft society gathers, where the cameras are rolling and the whole city is watching. And we detonate the entire archive at once, in public, and we let the trust that holds their empire together collapse in a single evening. And there is exactly one event like that coming, Adrian, in 3 weeks. She slid a heavy engraved invitation across the table. It was addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Adrian Thorne. It was for the annual Ashcroft Founders Gala, the single largest gathering of the city's elite, hosted this year, the invitation announced, jointly by the Ashford and Vaughan families, in celebration of the historic peace between the two great houses, sealed by the marriage of Adrian Thorne and Coraline Shaw. They're going to stand on a stage in front of the entire city, Coraline said softly, and celebrate the peace they made by marrying us to die. They're going to parade the two of us as proof of their reconciliation and their statesmanship, in front of every person whose belief keeps them powerful. And that, husband, is where we're going to take it all away from them. On their stage, at their gala, in front of their whole world. We're going to let them introduce us as the happy ending of their beautiful lie. Her smile was winter and steel, and then we're going to tell the truth. Before I could answer, one of Coraline's people knocked and entered, and his face was strange, uncertain. There's someone at the outer gate, he said. Alone, unarmed, asking to see you both. She says it's urgent, and she says to tell you. He hesitated. She says to tell you she knows she's a pawn now, and she wants to stop being one. I felt the floor tilt. Who is it? I said, though some part of me already knew. And Coraline's man said the name that turned the whole war sideways. Genevieve Sterling, he said. Your sister is at the gate, and she's crying. We did not let her in right away. Coraline was immovable on that point. It's either a genuine defection or it's a trap, she said, and the two look identical from the outside, and the price of being wrong is our lives, so we treat it as a trap until she proves it isn't, and we do not let a person who ordered your murder within 100 feet of you until I've had her searched, her phone taken, and her every word tested. If she's real, she'll understand why. If she objects, she's a trap. So Genevieve waited at the outer gate for an hour, while Coraline's people confirmed she'd come alone, unarmed, untracked, that no Ashford force was staging behind her, and only then did they bring her, phoneless and searched, into a bare room with no windows, and Coraline and I went in to face the sister who had signed my death. She looked terrible. That was the first thing that struck me, because Genevieve had never in her life looked anything but immaculate, the family jewel, the sweet-faced huntress, and the woman sitting at that table was pale and hollow-eyed and had clearly not slept, and when she saw me, she flinched, actually flinched, and I understood that whatever else this was, the fear in her was real. You're alive, she said, and her voice cracked. I kept telling myself the men just ran. But you're alive, and you're here, with her, and you know. You know, don't you? About all of it. I know you paid 3 men to murder me on my wedding night, I said, and my voice came out colder than I'd ever heard it. I know you rewrote a will and told me you'd take good care of my things. So whatever you've come here to say, Genevieve, You should know that I have your instructions to those men, signed and recorded, and that the only reason you're breathing right now is that my wife is more patient than I am. So talk. And it had better be the truth, because you're the last person on earth I'll believe, and you have exactly one chance to change that. And my sister Genevieve Sterling put her face in her hands and told us everything. And the horrible thing was that I believed her, because it was too pathetic to be a lie. Because no one constructs a trap out of their own humiliation. I thought I was one of them, she whispered. I thought I was a player. Father let me run the security, the problem resolution. He made me feel important. He made me feel like the clever one, and I ate it up, Adrian. I ate up being trusted with the ugly work because it meant I mattered. It meant I wasn't just the daughter to be married off. And I did terrible things. I did terrible things to feel like I belonged. And yes, God help me, I did them to you. Because you were the easy target. You were the one everyone already agreed didn't matter. And hurting you was the cheapest way to prove I was ruthless enough to deserve my seat at the table. She looked up, and her face was wet and stripped bare. And then 4 days ago, I overheard Father on the secure line, talking about the liquidation, the end game. And I listened for my place in it, Adrian. I listened for what happens to me when it's all finished, and there was no place. There's no place for me. Father and Gareth are going to take everything and vanish. And Sebastian? Sebastian's in deeper than I am. Sebastian thinks he's the heir, but he's just the one who'll be left holding the criminal end of it when it collapses. And me? I'm nothing. I'm a tool that gets thrown away when the job's done. Exactly like... Her voice broke completely. Exactly like you. I spent my whole life making sure I wasn't you. And it turns out I've been you all along. I've just been the version that helped them do it. And I can't. I can't be a pawn who helped murder her own brother, so a man who was always going to discard her could steal a fortune. I can't. So I came here. To the two people my family threw away. Because you're the only ones who could possibly understand. And because I would rather help you burn it all down than get quietly buried under it. And because... She looked at me. And there was something in her face I hadn't seen since we were children. Before the family taught us both what we were supposed to be. Because you're my brother. And I'm sorry. And I know sorry is worthless. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving it if you let me. And if you don't, I understand. But I had to come. I had to try. I couldn't be that person for one more day. The room was silent. I looked at my sister, and I felt 100 things at once. The old childhood love, buried under 20 years of cruelty. The fresh, clean fury at what she'd done. The wariness Coraline had drilled into me. And underneath all of it, the terrible recognition that she was telling the truth. That the family had done to her a slower version of what it had done to me. Had used her ruthlessness the way it had used my gentleness. Tools to be discarded. And that she had arrived, too late and drenched in blood, at the same truth I had. Coraline spoke first, and her voice was cold and precise. Here is the situation, Genevieve, she said. I believe you're sincere. I've watched a great many people lie, and you're not good enough to fake this. And desperation this specific can't be manufactured. But sincere and safe are different things. And a sincere pawn who's... Just realized the game is the most volatile asset imaginable, because you're frightened, and frightened people make mistakes, and one mistake gets us all killed. So I'm not going to trust you. But I am going to use you, and you're going to let me, gratefully, because it's the only path that ends with you alive and redeemed instead of dead or imprisoned. You're going to go back into that house, and you're going to be exactly the daughter they think you are. And you're going to bring me the one thing we still need, which your father guards more closely than his own life. We have the evidence to destroy the crime. We do not yet have the evidence to destroy the man, the personal proof, in your father's own voice or hand, that ties Arthur Caldwell directly to the murder of Isolde, Adrian's mother, 17 years ago. Everything else we can prove is corporate, financial, deniable, spinnable. But the murder of his own wife is the thing that turns him from a corrupt patriarch into a monster in the eyes of the city. And it's the one thing he'd never write down. Except that men like your father always keep something, a leverage, an insurance, because they trust no one, not even each other. And Arthur Caldwell has spent 40 years surviving Gareth Shaw by making sure he holds a knife to Gareth's throat at all times. Somewhere in that house, your father keeps his insurance against Gareth, and I would bet everything I own that his insurance includes the proof of what they did to Isolde, because that's the crime that binds them, the original sin they share. Find it, bring it to me. And you don't just get to live, Genevieve. You get to be the one who brought down the man who is going to discard you. You get to stop being the pawn and become the piece that ends the game." Genevieve stared at her, and then at me, and I saw her understand that she was being offered not forgiveness. Forgiveness would come later, or never, but something she needed more in that moment. A way to make her ruin mean something. "The Founder's Vault," she said slowly, thinking, becoming, despite everything, useful. "There's a private vault under the mansion that only Father has access to. I've never been inside, but I know where it is, and I know he goes there alone, always alone, before anything important, and I've always wondered what he keeps there that even Sebastian can't see." She looked up. "If his insurance exists, it's there. And the gala is in 3 weeks. And before the gala, Father will go to that vault, because before every major move, he goes to that vault. And this is the biggest move of his life." She took a breath. "I can't get into it, but I can tell you when he opens it, and you." She looked at me, at the brother she'd underestimated her whole life, exactly as everyone had. "You walked into Gareth Shaw's stronghold and walked out with his father's seal. Maybe the fool can walk into one more vault." Meanwhile, across the city, my father sat with Sebastian, and he did not know his daughter had defected, not yet, but the old lion felt the wind changing all the same. "Something's wrong," Arthur Caldwell said. "I can feel it. The boy, the witch, the old driver, and now Gareth's father is dead, and Gareth swears the succession is clean. But I don't like the timing. I don't like any of it." He stared into the fire. "Move the timeline up. The gala is too public, too exposed, too many things that can go wrong. We end this before the gala. We end all of it. The boy, the witch, and whatever they've gathered. And we do it quietly, in the next 2 weeks, and Sebastian." He turned to my brother, and his old face was the face of a man who had murdered before, and would again. "Watch your sister. She's been strange, frightened. I want to know where Genevieve goes and who she talks to, because in my experience, the first crack in a family always runs through the one who's just realized they're expendable." The vault plan should have been the cleanest operation of the whole war, and it nearly became the one that ended it, because we had made a single error, and the error was that we had underestimated my father the way everyone had always underestimated me, which is to say, fatally and from habit. Genevieve got word to us 3 days later. Our father was going to the Founder's Vault on the coming Friday night, alone, before a meeting she'd learned was scheduled with Gareth, and the house would be quiet, most of the staff dismissed for the evening, and there was a service passage from the old wine cellar that connected to the vault antechamber, a passage Genevieve knew from childhood games and that the security system, focused on the doors and the grounds, did not fully cover. It was, on paper, a clean run. I would go in through the cellar during my father's meeting with Gareth, when he was occupied and above ground, access the vault in the window between his opening it and his sealing it, photograph or take whatever insurance he kept there, and be gone before he returned. Coraline hated it. "It's too clean," she said, the night before, pacing the war room. "Genevieve's intelligence is too good, the window's too convenient, the passage is too perfect. Either your sister is genuinely giving us the keys to the kingdom, or your father has realized she's turned, and is feeding her exactly the bait that draws you into that cellar. And the problem, Adrian, the problem that's kept me awake, is that both of those are true at the same time, in every version I can construct. Genevieve is sincere, and your father is watching her, which means Genevieve can be completely genuine and still be the instrument that walks you into a trap, because she doesn't know she's being watched, and the intelligence she's giving us in good faith is intelligence your father is allowing her to have." She stopped pacing. "So we do it, because we need what's in that vault, and there's no other way to get it, and the gala is too close to wait. But we do it assuming it's a trap, which means I'm not sitting in this house while you walk into your father's cellar. I'm coming, and my people are coming, and we're going in prepared to be ambushed, because the only thing worse than walking into a trap is walking into one you refuse to see coming." She was right, of course. She was right about everything, and it saved our lives. Friday night, I went into the Ashford mansion through the wine cellar, the house I'd grown up in, the house where I'd been made small for 26 years. And it was strange and terrible to move through it as an intruder, past the rooms where I'd been mocked, toward the vault where my father kept the proof of the worst thing he'd ever done. And I found the vault open, exactly as Genevieve had said, my father having descended to it before his meeting, exactly as she'd predicted, the heavy door ajar, the antechamber empty. It was all exactly as promised, which is how I knew, the moment I stepped into that antechamber, that Coraline had been right. Because a thing that goes exactly as promised in a war like this is not a gift. It is a mouth, and it was already closing. The vault held everything, and it was a lie. Inside, in the founder's vault under the Ashford mansion, I found my father's insurance, a strongbox, and inside the strongbox, exactly as Coraline had predicted, the proof, documents, and a recording. My father and Gareth, 17 years ago, discussing the handling of Isolde, my mother, the arrangement of her death, the doctor who was paid, the poison that mimicked a failing heart, all of it, the murder of my mother in my father's own careful voice, kept for southern years as leverage against the man who shared the crime. I had it in my hands, the last piece, the thing that turned Arthur Caldwell from a corrupt patriarch into the man who murdered his own wife. And that was the moment the lights in the antechamber went out, and the vault door behind me swung shut, and my father's voice came from a speaker in the wall, calm and cold and almost sad. "Hello, Adrian," said Arthur Caldwell. "I did wonder if you'd inherited more of your mother than her gentleness. It seems you have. She walked into a trap too, you know, at the end. Cleverness runs in that side of the family. So does the inability to imagine that someone you love has already decided to let you die." The vault was airtight. I understood that instantly, the way you understand a thing your body has known before your mind catches up. The door sealed, the antechamber sealed, the air already beginning to feel close, and my father's voice explaining, unhurried, that the meeting with Gareth was a fiction, that he'd known Genevieve had turned for a week, that he'd fed her the vault, that he'd let me walk in to take the very evidence that would now be sealed in a tomb with me, that in the morning there would simply be a tragic accident, the disappointment son suffocated in an old vault he'd broken into out of greed, and the evidence gone, and everything tidy. "I'm sorry in a way," my father said. "You were more than I thought. But more is worse, Adrian. More is dangerous. Gentle and stupid I could have kept alive as a joke. Gentle and clever I have to bury, the same way I buried your mother, for the same reason, because people who see clearly cannot be allowed to keep breathing near what I've built." And then, over the speaker, I heard my father settle in to wait, patient as the grave, for the air to run out. What my father did not know, what no one had told him, what Coraline had insisted on precisely because she'd assumed this exact trap, was that I was not alone, and that the wine cellar passage he'd left open as bait was, at that moment, full of Coraline Shaw's people, and that Coraline herself was in that cellar, with a device her network had built for exactly this kind of contingency, and that the moment the vault door sealed, she moved. I heard it start, faintly, through the sealed door, the sounds of a fight, my father's hidden ambush team meeting Coraline's people in the dark cellar. And I heard my father's voice change, the calm cracking, as reports reached him that the cellar was not empty, that the witch was here, that this was not the clean disposal of a lone fool, but a battle. And I pounded on the sealed door and shouted, and I heard, muffled and furious and beautiful, Coraline's voice on the other side. "Julian, hold on! The door's on a manual override. Genevieve's schematics were real, even if your father corrupted the plan. We're at the panel. Hold on, breathe slow. I am not going to lose you in your father's basement. Do you hear me, husband? Breathe slow and hold on." And I slid down the sealed door with the proof of my mother's murder clutched to my chest and the air going thin, and I breathed slow, and I held on, because my wife had told me to, and because I had promised her I'd come home, and because for the first time in my life, someone was tearing a vault open with her bare hands, rather than let me die. The minutes in that vault were the longest of my life, and I learned something in them about myself and about my father both. The air went thin slowly, and my thoughts went strange, and in the dark, sealed in my father's tomb with the proof of my mother's murder against my chest, I did not think about dying. I thought about her. I thought about the little wooden ship. I thought about her hands holding it, saying, "The fact that they can't see that is not a flaw in you, my darling. It is a flaw in them." And I understood, in that thinning dark, the final shape of the thing, which is that my father had sealed my mother in a kind of vault too, 17 years ago, a vault made of lies instead of stone, and that she had died in it, alone, disbelieved, with no one tearing at the door, and that the only difference between her death and the one my father intended for me was that I was not alone. That I had done the one thing she told me to do not be alone, and that her death and my survival came down to that single word, alone, and that my father, who understood everything about power and nothing about people, had never once imagined that the disposable son would have someone on the other side of the door who would rather die than let him go. My father's voice came through the speaker once more, near the end, and it had lost its calm, because the sounds of battle in his cellar had told him something was wrong, and he said, "Adrian, Whatever she's doing out there, it won't be fast enough. I've timed that vault. I know exactly how long. And I found, even then, even with the air nearly gone, that I could laugh. And I put my mouth near the speaker, and I used some of my last breath to say the truest thing I knew. You timed the vault, Father. You never once timed her. That was always your mistake. You measure everything except the people you throw away. And I heard, on the other side of the sealed steel, a sound I had waited my whole life to hear from Arthur Caldwell. The sound of a man who had just realized he had miscalculated. And then the manual override engaged, and the great door groaned, and light and air came pouring in. The door opened, air rushed in, and Coraline Shaw hauled me out of my father's tomb and into her arms, both of us filthy and shaking, her people covering the passage behind us. And above us in the house, I heard my father's voice raised for the first time in my life, raised in genuine fury, because his clean disposal had become an open war in his own basement, and the fool and the witch were escaping with the one piece of evidence he'd killed to protect. We got out. We got out with everything, my mother's murder in my hands, the last piece, the whole, complete, devastating archive, all of it. And we left my father standing in the wreckage of his own trap, understanding at last that he was not hunting a disappointment. He was at war with two people who had beaten him at every single move, and that the gala was 2 weeks away, and that whatever we were building toward, he could no longer stop it. He could only try to reach it first. In the car, speeding away from the house where I grew up and nearly died, Coraline held my hand so hard it ached, and she didn't say anything for a long time, and then she said, quietly, not looking at me, "When the door sealed. When I heard him seal you in. I have not been that afraid in 10 years. I have spent a decade making sure I never cared about anything enough to be that afraid again. And you undid it in 3 weeks, and I want you to know that if you ever walk into a room and let a door close between us again, I will be extremely angry, because I have just discovered that I would tear apart the foundations of the earth to reach you, and that is a terrifying thing to learn about yourself in the basement of your enemy." And I lifted her hand to my lips, filthy and trembling as we both were, and I said, "Then let's make sure the next door we walk through together. In front of everyone. On their stage." And Coraline finally looked at me, and through the fear and the adrenaline and the 10 years of armor, she smiled. "The gala," she said. 2 weeks. Let's go end them." The 2 weeks before the gala were the most dangerous of the whole war, because a cornered predator is at its most lethal, and we had cornered 2 of them at once. My father knew the disposal had failed. He knew we had escaped with something. He did not know exactly what or exactly how much, but he knew enough to understand that the boy he'd thrown away had become an existential threat, and men like my father do not respond to existential threats with restraint. The first casualty was almost Genevieve. Her cover had held through the vault trap, barely. My father had fed her the bait, believing she was compromised but not certain, and in the aftermath his uncertainty curdled into conviction. Sebastian, watching her as our father had ordered, caught her making a call she shouldn't have, and within hours, the family had turned on the family jewel, and Genevieve Sterling went from huntress to hunted in a single afternoon, and she got exactly one frantic message out to us before they took her phone. "They know," it said. "Sebastian's coming. I'm sorry for everything, and it's okay. I earned this. Just finish it. Burn it all down, and don't stop for me." I looked at Coraline, and I did not hesitate, and I think that was the moment she finally, fully understood who she'd married, because the old Adrian, the one my family had built, would have accepted that a sister who tried to kill him deserved whatever came. But I wasn't that Adrian anymore. "We're getting her out," I said. "She tried to murder me, and she's a wreck, and she's the reason we almost died in that vault, even if she didn't mean to be, and we're getting her out anyway, because if we let my family destroy the one person who turned against them to help us, then we're not better than they are. We're just the winning version of them, and I did not survive all of this to become my father with a cleaner conscience." Coraline looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, softly, "My grandfather would have liked you," and she picked up the phone and gave the order, and we got Genevieve out. It cost us. It cost us one of Coraline's people, a man named Finn who'd been with her for 6 years, who held a stairwell so that Genevieve could reach the extraction car, and did not come back. And Coraline went very quiet when she got that news. And later that night, I found her alone. And she was not crying. Coraline almost never cried. But she was sitting in the dark with a terrible stillness. And she said, "Finn followed me when everyone else believed I was a monster. He was one of the 7 people in the world who knew I wasn't. And now he's dead, getting your sister out of a trap your sister helped build. She looked up at me. I don't regret the order. I'd give it again. But I need you to understand the price of the kind of people we're choosing to be, Adrian, because they're going to keep charging it, right up until the end. And the day it stops costing us people is the day we've become the thing we're fighting. So we grieve him. Tonight. Properly. And tomorrow, we make sure it meant something. So we grieved Finn, the two of us, a man I'd never met who died for my sister. And I learned that night the weight of the people who follow you into a war. And I have never forgotten it. 2 days later, we went to see his wife. Coraline insisted on it, and she insisted on going herself, in person, which is not what people in our families do. People in our families send money and a letter written by someone else. And she said, "My uncle sent a letter when my mother died. A beautiful letter. Someone else wrote it. I have spent 10 years hating that letter. I will not send a letter." So we drove out to a small house in a plain street, and Finn's wife opened the door, and she knew, of course she knew, and she looked at Coraline, and Coraline stood there on that doorstep, the most feared woman in the city, and said, "My name is Coraline. Your husband died following an order I gave. He didn't die for a cause, or a family, or a fortune. He died getting a frightened woman out of a cellar because I asked him to. And I want you to hear from me, not from a letter, exactly what he did and exactly who gave the order, so that you have someone real to blame. And I want you to know that I will carry him, and that your daughter will never want for anything as long as I am breathing. And that none of that is enough, and I know it isn't." And Finn's wife stood in her doorway and looked at her for a long, long moment. And then she said, "He believed in you. He used to say, 'They've got her wrong, all of them. She's the only honest one up there.'" And she began to cry, and she said, "Was he right? Tell me he was right." And Coraline Shaw, who did not cry in front of anyone, who had not cried in front of anyone in 10 years, said, "He was right. And I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure it was worth it." And then she put her arms around that woman and held her while she wept. And I stood on that little path in a plain street and watched the woman the world called a monster do the most human thing I have ever seen a person do. Finn's daughter is 19 now. She runs a department at the foundation. She has her father's steadiness, and every year, on the day, we go back to that house. I was in the car for the extraction. Coraline fought me on it and lost, because I told her that I would not sit safe in a house on a cliff while other people risk themselves for my sister, that I had spent 26 years being the one who stayed behind, and I was finished with it. And she looked at me for a long moment and said, "You're going to be the death of me, husband," and handed me a radio. We took her out of the Ashford mansion at 3 in the morning, through the same wine cellar passage my father had once used to bait me, which has a symmetry I've never stopped appreciating. Genevieve came down the stairs barefoot, in a nightgown, with a split lip, because Sebastian had already started, because my brother had never in his life needed a reason to hurt someone smaller. And when she saw me standing in the dark at the bottom of those stairs, the brother she'd ordered killed, come personally to get her out, she stopped dead and made a sound I will hear for the rest of my life. A raw, broken animal sound of a person receiving a mercy she knows she has not earned. And then Sebastian's men came into the cellar behind her. And Finn, who I had met exactly twice, who had a wife and a daughter and 6 years of loyalty to a woman the world called a witch, put his hand flat on my chest and shoved me toward the passage and said, "Get her out, get him out, I have the stairs," and turned around, and that was the last thing he ever said to anyone. We got out. He didn't. And I sat in the back of that car with my bleeding sister, and I listened to the radio go quiet, and Coraline, driving, did not say a word, and her hands on the wheel were perfectly steady, and that steadiness was the most frightening and the most heartbreaking thing I have ever seen, because I understood that she had learned, at 14, how to keep driving while something inside her died, and that she had had to use that skill again, for my sister, at my request. Genevieve, when she arrived at the estate, was broken in a way that went beyond the physical. Her family had turned on her, hunted her, tried to kill her, and the reality of what she'd been part of had finally, fully landed. She could barely look at me. "Finn," she whispered when she learned. "Someone died getting me out. I've spent my whole life spending other people's lives without a second thought, and now someone spent his for me, and I don't know how to hold that." "You hold it by making it worth something," I said, echoing Coraline without meaning to. "You've got 2 weeks. You know things about that house and that family that we still need. Finn bought you a chance to make your ruin mean something. Don't waste it grieving. Spend it." And Genevieve Sterling, the discarded jewel, wiped her face and nodded, and became, in those final 2 weeks, one of the most valuable weapons we had. Because a defector who's had everything taken from her and has nothing left to protect is a defector who tells you all of it. While that unfolded, Coraline was fighting the other half of the war, the quieter, more important half, because a public detonation of evidence is only as powerful as the people ready to act on it, and the great weakness of every previous attempt to stop our families, my mother's, Coraline's grandfather's, was that the truth had died with no one positioned to catch it. We would not make that mistake. With her grandfather's seal, his recorded denunciation, and his signed instrument naming her heir, Coraline began, secretly, methodically, to reach the honest members of the Thorne clan, the loyalists who had served her grandfather, the cousins and officers and old retainers who had swallowed the lie about Coraline because they had no reason not to, and one by one, in careful private meetings, she showed them the truth, the seal, their dying patriarch's own voice, and one by one, she turned the family her uncle thought he controlled. It was slow, and it was dangerous, and any one of them could have betrayed her to Gareth. But Coraline had spent 10 years learning exactly who in that family was rotten and who was merely deceived, and she chose her people with the precision of a surgeon. I went with her to one of those meetings, and it showed me something about my wife I had not fully understood. The man was her cousin Lysander, a decent, dull, frightened man who had spent 10 years avoiding her in corridors. And when he walked into that room and saw her waiting, he actually flinched, physically flinched, from a woman he had known since she was a child. And I watched Coraline absorb that flinch, the way she had absorbed 10,000 of them, without a flicker. She simply played her grandfather's recording. And Lysander listened to the old patriarch he had worshipped denounce his own son and name Coraline heir. And he went white, and he sat down heavily, and he said, oh God, Coraline, what we said about you, what I let people say about you. At my own table, I never once. And he could not finish. And Coraline said quietly, stop. I don't need your guilt, Lysander. Guilt is useless to me, and it's expensive to receive. I need your ships, and your signature, and your voice at the gala. Give me those, and we'll never have to discuss the other thing. And in 20 years, you can tell yourself you always knew. And afterward in the car, I said, he was ashamed. You could have had his loyalty for the rest of his life if you'd let him apologize properly. And Coraline stared out the window for a long time, and then said, I know. I've never been able to do it. When someone starts to apologize for the 10 years, something in me shuts a door. Because if I let one of them in, if I let myself feel how much it cost, I don't think I could stand it. I think I would simply stop functioning. And I have not been able to afford to stop functioning since I was 14. And she turned and looked at me and she said, you're the only person I've ever let all the way in. And I need you to understand that it's not because you deserved it more than the others. It's because you got there before I built the door. You moved into my house on the worst night of my life, and you were kind to me before I had time to stop you. And I took her hand, and neither of us said anything else the rest of the way home. And by the end of the 2 weeks, she had done the impossible. She had assembled, in secret, a block of Thorne loyalists, ready to recognize her as the true heir the moment her grandfather's denunciation went public, ready to seize the Thorne holdings out of Gareth's hands in the chaos of the gala, an honest faction waiting to catch a falling house. I did the same on the Ashford side, and it was harder because I had no seal, no dying patriarch's blessing, only my mother's memory and the truth and a lifetime of being underestimated. But it turned out that a lifetime of being the family disappointment had given me something Coraline's careful intelligence couldn't. It had given me the people at the bottom, the dock workers and mill hands and low clerks I'd been mocked for caring about, the people my family had bled for 4 generations and never once seen. And when the family failure came to them quietly, with proof of what the Ashfords truly were and a plan to bring them down, I found an army where my father had only ever seen furniture. Silas Croft was the key that unlocked them, 30 years of trust at the docks, and through Silas, I reached the honest core of the Ashford operation, the people who kept the real business running while the family played its games. And I made them a promise my father never had, that if we won, the house we built out of the ashes would remember whose backs it stood on. The night I stood up in front of them is one I'll remember until I die. It was a cold warehouse, 300 men and women who had spent their lives loading Ashford ships, and they looked at me with a suspicion so thick you could lean on it. Because I was an Ashford, and every Ashford who had ever come down to the docks had come to take something. And I didn't give them a speech. I found I couldn't. I stood up on a crate in front of 300 exhausted people, and what came out of me was the truth. My name is Adrian Thorne, I said, And my family has stolen from you for 4 generations, and I did nothing about it. Because they made me small, and I let them. And I'm ashamed of that. And I'm not going to stand up here and pretend otherwise. Silence. Not a friendly silence. 22 days ago, my father hired men to murder me because I was worth more to him dead than alive. And I want you to understand why I'm telling you that, because it isn't for your sympathy. It's because I finally understand what I am. I'm what you are. I'm what he thinks you are. Disposable. He looks at me the way he looks at you, as a cost. And I have proof, in writing, in his own voice, of what he and Gareth Shaw have done to this city, and to my mother, and to every one of you. And in 2 weeks, I'm going to put it in front of the whole world, and I am probably going to die doing it. And I need to know whether the people at the bottom of this house will stand with me, or whether you'll do what everybody always does, which is wait to see who wins and then serve them. And an old woman near the front, a crane operator with 40 years in that yard, stood up and said, "Your mother came down here once. Is sold. Long time back. She sat in this yard and asked us our names. Every one. Wrote 'em down." Her voice cracked. "No Ashford before or since ever asked me my name, boy. What's changed?" And I said, "I know your name, Mrs. Finch. My mother's notebook still exists. Silas kept it. It has all of you in it." And I held it up, my mother's little book of names, 17 years old, kept safe by an old driver in a warehouse safe. And I watched 300 hard, tired, deeply suspicious people go absolutely silent. And then I watched the whole room stand up, and I understood in that moment exactly what my father had never understood in 80 years, which is that power does not actually live in vaults or ledgers or family names. It lives in whether the people holding the ropes decide to let go. And my father had spent his entire life making sure that every single one of them had a reason to. Meanwhile, my father and Gareth prepared for the gala too, but they prepared for the wrong war. They knew we were coming, but they thought we were coming to disrupt, to embarrass, perhaps to make some accusation they could spin as the desperate lies of a disgraced fool and a mad witch. They stationed security. They prepared statements. They readied the machinery of denial and suppression they'd used for decades. They did not understand that we were not bringing an accusation. We were bringing proof, complete, layered, undeniable, and an audience of 10,000, and 2 waiting factions ready to seize both houses the instant the trust collapsed. They were preparing to win an argument. We were preparing to end a dynasty. The night before, Coraline said, the eve of the gala, as we stood together on the balcony of the great dark house that had become, somewhere in the war, a home, is always the strangest. Everything is done, everything is placed, and there's nothing left but to walk into their stage and pull it down. And I have wanted this for 10 years, and now that it's here, I find I'm not thinking about revenge at all. She leaned into me, and I put my arm around her, and below us the city glittered, both our families down there in it, sleeping, plotting, unaware. "What are you thinking about?" I asked. "You," she said simply. "Whether we live through tomorrow, what we build if we do. 10 years I planned to burn it all down and salt the earth, and then I married a gentle fool who talks about remembering whose backs the house stands on. And now I find I don't want to just destroy them, Adrian. I want to replace them. I want to take these 2 rotten houses and build something out of them that my grandfather and your mother would have recognized. Something that doesn't eat its own children." She looked up at me. "Is that naive? After everything?" "My mother wrote that the truth in the right hands is the only weapon that ever frightened men like my father," I said. "I think the right hands don't just want to win. I think they want to build. So no, it's not naive. It's the whole point." And Coraline Shaw kissed me on the balcony the night before we brought down 2 empires, and neither of us said the thing we both feared, which was that men like our fathers do not lose gracefully, and that a cornered predator on its own stage, with everything to lose, might decide that if it could not win, it would at least make sure that the 2 who beat it did not live to enjoy it. The Ashcroft Founders Gala was held in the Grand Hall of the Old Exchange, a cathedral of marble and gold, where the city's wealth had gathered to admire itself for 100 years. And that night, 10,000 of the most powerful people in Ashcroft filled it, and the cameras of every outlet in the city broadcast it live, because the historic peace between the Ashford and Vaughan clans was the story of the season, and the marriage that sealed it, my marriage, was the centerpiece. In the car outside, before we went in, we sat for a moment in the dark with the engine off and the lights of the exchange blazing through the windshield, and neither of us moved. We both knew the arithmetic. There was a real chance, a substantial chance, that one or both of us would not walk out of that building. And Coraline, without looking at me, said, "If it goes wrong in there, if they reach us, you run. Don't be brave, don't come back for me, run for the west doors, our people are there. Promise me." And I said, "No." And she turned and looked at me, furious, and I said, before she could speak, "You told me once that you'd tear apart the foundations of the earth to reach me. Did you think that only went one way? I'm not running, Coraline. I spent 26 years being the one who survives by staying small and staying out of it. And I'm not doing it tonight, not for you. Whatever's in that room, we walk into it together, and we walk out of it together. Or we don't. And that's the whole deal. And you married me, so you're stuck with it." And she stared at me, and her eyes were bright, and she said, in a voice I'd never heard from her, small and shaken and completely undefended, "I'm frightened, Adrian. I've wanted this for 10 years, and I'm so frightened I can barely breathe. And it isn't the dying. I made my cheese with the dying a long time ago. It's that I only just got a life. 3 months. That's all I've had of being a person instead of a weapon. And it isn't enough. It isn't nearly enough. And I want more. I want years. I want to be greedy and ordinary, and have you, and be happy. And I have never in my life wanted anything that badly, and I don't know how to carry it into that room." And I took my wife's face in my hands, in the dark, outside the building where we were about to destroy 2 empires, and I said, "Then we don't do this for revenge. Everyone in that hall thinks we're here for revenge. We're not. We're here so that you get your years. We're here so that Isolde's name means something, and Finn's daughter is safe, and 300 people at the docks get to be seen, and so that you and I get to be greedy and ordinary and happy for a very long time, and the only thing standing between us and that is 1 hour on that stage. So let's go take our years." And Coraline Shaw breathed out and steadied and became again the woman who had planned this for a decade, and she said, "All right." And then, with the ghost of a smile, "You know, when they married me to the family fool, I really did think I'd drawn the short straw." "You did," I said. "I'm terrible at this. You're the best thing that ever happened to me," she said. "Try not to die." And we got out of the car. Coraline and I arrived as the happy couple, and we played it perfectly, radiant, in love, the living proof of reconciliation. And I watched my father and Gareth Shaw watch us across the great hall with the cold attention of men who knew a reckoning was coming and believed they'd prepared for it. They had security everywhere. They had their statements ready. They were braced for an accusation. They had no idea that the accusation had already been distributed, that in the hours before the gala, Coraline's people and mine had placed the complete archive into the hands of every honest journalist, every waiting loyalist, every honest official the conspiracy hadn't managed to buy. Time to release the instant we gave the signal, so that even if we were silenced on that stage, the truth would already be everywhere, unkillable, 10,000 copies in 10,000 hands. That was the lesson of my mother's death and Coraline's grandfather's helplessness, distilled into a single principle. You do not bring the truth to one place where it can be buried. You bring it to everywhere at once. The evening built toward its centerpiece, and at the appointed hour, my father took the stage, Gareth beside him, the 2 great patriarchs together, and the hall fell into adoring silence, and Arthur Caldwell began to speak about peace, about legacy, about the burying of an ancient feud, about the union of 2 great houses in the marriage of his beloved son, and the hypocrisy of it, the sheer scale of the lie. The man who had murdered my mother and sealed me in a tomb, standing before the city calling me his beloved son, filled me not with rage, but with a cold, clear, almost peaceful certainty, because the higher he built the lie, the further it had to fall. "And now," my father said, gesturing grandly toward us, "I'd like to invite my son Adrian and his wife Coraline to the stage, to say a few words about the future our families are building together." It was the moment they'd designed to parade us. It was the moment we'd designed to end them. Coraline squeezed my hand once, and we walked up onto the stage, into the lights, in front of 10,000 people and every camera in the city, and my father handed me the microphone with a warm, public smile and a look in his eyes that was pure private warning. "Don't, boy, don't you dare." And I took the microphone, and I looked out at the sea of faces, and I looked at my father, and I looked at Coraline, and I began. "Thank you," I said. "Thank you all for coming to celebrate our marriage. My father is right that it represents the end of something ancient between our families and the beginning of something new. He's just wrong about what." The hall was quiet, expectant, not yet understanding. My father's smile did not waver, but I saw his hand move, a small signal to his people. 3 months ago," I said, my voice carrying clear and steady through the great hall. My family married me to Coraline Shaw as a joke. They called her a cursed witch. They told the whole city she would kill me. And on my wedding night, they arranged for exactly that. They hired men to murder me and blame my new wife, so that my father could inherit my share and sue the Vorns for my death, all while the feud that supposedly justified it raged on as cover. A ripple went through the crowd, confusion, discomfort, the first uncertain murmur. My father stepped toward me, reaching for the microphone, saying warmly, urgently, "Adrian, this isn't the time for one of your..." And I stepped back and kept talking, and Coraline moved smoothly between me and my father. And behind us, at the edges of the hall, I saw them, the loyalists, Vorn and Ashford both, quietly taking their positions. "But the joke was on them," I said, louder now, "because the cursed witch turned out to be the only person in this city who didn't want me dead. And together, my wife and I spent 3 months learning the truth about our families, and I'm going to share it with you now, all of you, and it's going to be broadcast to the whole city, and it has already been placed in the hands of 100 journalists and honest officials. So before anyone on this stage considers stopping me, understand that it is far, far too late. The truth is already everywhere. The only thing left to decide is whether you hear it from me or read it tomorrow." And I gave the signal. Coraline's people activated the hall's great screens, and my father's voice, 17 years old, filled the cathedral of marble and gold. His voice, arranging the murder of my mother, Isolde, the doctor, the poison, the failing heart. 10,000 people heard Arthur Caldwell, pillar of the city, describe killing his own wife, and the hall erupted, and it did not stop there. Coraline stepped forward, and her clear, cold voice rang out. "My name is Coraline Shaw, and for 10 years my Uncle Gareth told this city I was a monster, so that no one would believe me when I said what I'm about to say." And the screens showed her dying grandfather, the founding patriarch of the Vorn clan, denouncing his own son in his own failing voice, naming Gareth's crimes, naming Coraline his true heir. And the Vorn loyalists in the hall rose as one, and I watched Gareth Shaw's decade of careful lies collapse in the space of 90 seconds. And still it did not stop. The shared fund, the fake feud, the two patriarchs' partnership laid bare in their own records. My sisters hired assassins, on record, naming the conspiracy. Piece after piece after piece, an avalanche of proof pouring down on 10,000 witnesses and every camera in Ashcroft. The two great houses stripped naked in front of the entire city, whose trust was the only thing that had ever made them powerful. And I watched that trust die. I watched it die in real time on 10,000 faces, the adoration curdling into horror and then into fury. The partners and bankers and officials in society that had propped up two rotten houses for 100 years recoiling all at once. And I understood that Coraline had been exactly right, that there was no vault deep enough and no lawyer clever enough to bury a truth that 10,000 people had witnessed together in a single unforgettable hour. There was a moment in the middle of it that I will carry forever. As the evidence poured down and the hall came apart and my father stood frozen in the wreckage of his own lie, a woman near the front, an old society matron who had known my mother, pushed forward through the crowd, and she was weeping, and she cried out over the chaos, "Isolde knew! She came to me once, years ago. She tried to tell me and I didn't listen. Oh God, Isolde knew, and we called her hysterical." And other voices took it up. Other people who had been fed the lie about my gentle mother's decline 17 years ago, suddenly understanding what they'd been made to believe. And I stood on that stage and watched my mother be believed at last, 17 years too late, and exactly on time, by the same city that had let her die. And I felt Coraline's hand find mine, and she leaned close, under the roar, and she said, "She's here, Adrian, right now. Everyone in this room is finally hearing her. You did that. You gave your mother her voice back in front of the whole world." And I could not speak. I could only grip her hand and let the truth I'd carried for 17 years finally land where it belonged. And I looked out at the 10,000 faces, and I did the thing I'd promised myself I would do if we ever got this far. The thing that mattered more to me than any accusation. I raised the microphone one more time, over the chaos, and I said, "There are people in this hall tonight who kept these families running for 100 years and were never once thanked for it. Dock workers, mill hands, drivers, clerks. The people my father called furniture and Gareth Shaw called nobody. They're the reason there was ever a fortune to steal. And when this is over, when these two houses answer for what they've done, I want every one of them to know that the failure son saw them, that the witch saw them, that we always saw them, and that whatever we build out of these ashes, we build for you." And from the edges of that glittering hall, from the places where the staff and the workers stood, there rose a sound I had never heard directed at an Ashford in my whole life. A sound of people who had been invisible for 100 years being seen. And it was, I think, the moment my father finally understood that he had lost not just a battle, but a world. Because the people he'd counted on to stay beneath his notice had just been noticed, by name, in front of everyone. And there is no putting a truth like that back in the box. My father and Gareth did what cornered predators do. They stopped pretending. My father's face, when the recording of my mother's murder finished playing, was no longer the face of a statesman. It was the face of the killer underneath. And he gave the real signal, the one to his security, the order to end it the only way left, violently, publicly, to kill the two of us on the stage and fight their way out through the chaos. And for one terrible instant, it might have worked, because my father's men moved, and Gareth's men moved. But they had made the same mistake every predator in this story made. They had counted the pieces on the board and forgotten the ones they'd thrown away. Because the security in that hall was not, most of it, loyal to two exposed murderers. Coraline had spent 2 weeks turning the Thorne loyalists, and I had spent 2 weeks with the people at the bottom that my family never saw. And when my father gave the order to kill us, his own men hesitated, and the loyalists we'd placed did not. And Genevieve, my sister, standing at the front of the crowd where I hadn't even known she was, screamed to the whole hall, "He killed our mother! He tried to kill me! Don't you dare protect him!" The family jewel turning on the family in front of everyone. And in the chaos, the honest factions of both houses moved, and the two patriarchs' violent gambit died in the space between the order and the execution. Because you cannot fight your way out of a room when the people holding the guns have just learned exactly who you are. It was over in minutes. Arthur Caldwell and Gareth Shaw, the architects of 17 years of lies, the murderers of my mother and the poisoners of Coraline's grandfather, were seized on their own stage, at their own gala, in front of the entire city, by their own people. And I stood there in the lights with my wife's hand in mine and watched two empires fall. And I felt, more than anything, my mother, standing just behind me, finally, after 17 years, avenged. Sebastian tried to run. My golden brother, the heir who was always going to be left holding the criminal end of it, understood in that collapsing hall exactly what our father had planned for him. And he tried to slip away in the chaos. And it was Silas Croft, of all people, old Silas at the exit with a handful of dock workers who'd come to see the family that bled them finally answer for it, who blocked his path. And Sebastian looked at the driver he'd dismissed as nobody his whole life. And Silas said, quietly, "Your mother was kind to me, boy. You never were. Sit down." And Sebastian sat down. And Gareth, being seized, screamed at my father that this was his fault. And my father, being seized, said nothing at all, only looked across the ruin of everything he'd built at the son he'd thrown away, the disappointment, the joke, the boy he'd sealed in a tomb. And I met my father's eyes across that hall, and I did not gloat, and I did not rage. I simply looked at him, and I let him see, at last, exactly who had been underneath the fool the whole time. And I watched Arthur Caldwell understand, in the final second before they took him away, that he had not been destroyed by an enemy. He had been destroyed by the child he taught the whole world to underestimate, using the exact lesson that underestimation had taught. The trials took the better part of a year, and I will not bore you with the machinery of them, except to say that a case witnessed live by 10,000 people and distributed to 100 journalists before anyone could bury it is a case that does not lose. My father and Gareth Shaw had spent decades buying the law, but they had bought it quietly, in the dark. And the one thing bought men cannot survive is daylight, and we had brought them into the brightest daylight the city had ever seen. One by one, the officials they'd owned discovered a sudden passion for justice, once the whole city was watching. One by one, the pieces of the conspiracy came apart in court exactly as they'd come apart on the stage. Arthur Caldwell was convicted of the murder of my mother, Isolde, 17 years late, and of the attempted murder of his own son, and of enough financial crime to bury 10 men. And he went to prison, an old man, and he will die there. And on the day of his sentencing, he looked at me across the courtroom one last time, and I looked back, and neither of us said anything, because everything had already been said in the second before they took him off the stage, when he finally saw me. I did go to see him once. Only once, about a year after the sentencing, and I have never been entirely sure why, except that Coraline said go if you need to, but go knowing he will try to take something from you, because that is the only thing he has ever known how to do, and go anyway, and come home to me after. So I went, and my father sat across from me in a gray room, in a gray uniform, an old man now, genuinely old, the lion gone, and he looked at me for a long moment, and then he said, "You've done well with the houses. I've read about it. Giving the money away. He shook his head, and there was something almost fond in it, something almost like the old dismissal. Sentimental, your mother's flaw. You'll ruin in 20 years what took 4 generations to build. And I realized, sitting there, that he had learned nothing. That he was not sorry, that he would never be sorry, that he did not have the equipment for it, and that he had summoned me here not to reconcile but to try, one last time, to make me small. Because making me small was the only relationship he had ever been able to have with me. And I felt the old reflex rise, the desperate need to defend myself, to explain, to make him see. And then I felt it die, quietly, and something enormous went out of me with it. Some weight I'd carried since I was 8 years old holding a little wooden ship. You know what's strange, Father? I said. I came here thinking I wanted an apology. I don't. I don't want anything from you. That's the thing I came here to find out, and I've found it out, and it's the last thing I'll ever need from you. I stood up. Mother was right about everything. About you, about the family, about me. She said the thing they couldn't see was the thing that would save me, and it did. Everything good in my life came from the parts of me you threw away. And I looked down at the small gray man who had murdered my mother and sealed me in a vault, and I felt, at last, nothing at all. No rage, no hunger, no need. Goodbye, Father. And I walked out. And he called after me, my name, twice, and there was something in his voice at the end. Panic, maybe. The sound of a man who had suddenly grasped that he was about to be left, truly left, in a gray room, by the only person still willing to come. And I did not turn around, and I have not seen him since, and I do not think about him much. That is what actually happened to Arthur Caldwell. Not the prison. The prison was nothing. What happened to him is that he finally got a son who did not need him, and it destroyed him more completely than any court ever could. Gareth Shaw fell the same way, convicted of hastening his own father's death, of a decade of theft from his own family, of his part in the whole vast machine, and the Thorne loyalists Coraline had turned made very sure that not one thread of his corruption escaped the light. Sebastian, my golden brother, testified against our father in the end, exactly as men like Sebastian always do, trying to save himself, and it did not save him, because the crimes were too many and the witnesses too public, and the heir who was always going to be left holding the criminal end of it was, in the end, left holding exactly that. The last I heard of Sebastian, he was a diminished man in a cell writing appeals that no one read, and I confess I do not think about him often, which is its own kind of ending for a man who spent his whole life needing to be the most important person in every room. And Genevieve. My sister's story is the one people ask about most, because it's the hardest. She had ordered my murder. She had also turned against everything to help us, been hunted for it, watched a man die getting her out, and stood up in front of the whole city to denounce our father. Both of those things are true, and neither cancels the other, and I have never pretended otherwise. She was not simply forgiven, and she did not simply become good. What she did was harder and more real than that. I was in the courtroom the day she took the stand, and the prosecutor, who had offered her a deal that would have buried her own role, asked her the question that the deal had been designed to let her dodge, asked it almost gently, expecting the practiced answer. And my sister looked past him, at me, and then at the room, and she said, I want the record to show that I was not coerced, and I was not manipulated, and I was not a victim. I hired 3 men to strangle my brother in his bed and to leave his body where his wife would be blamed for it. And I did it because I wanted my father's approval, and because I had decided that Adrian's life was worth less than my ambition. My father did not force me to. He simply never taught me that a person could be worth something, and I never once questioned it, and that is not an excuse, that is my confession. The courtroom was absolutely silent, and she said, I am going to prison, and I should, and when I come out, I am going to spend the rest of my life on the other side of the ledger, and no part of that will undo it, and I am not asking anyone in this room to forgive me. I am only asking that it be written down accurately, because my family has lied about everything for 100 years, and I would like one true thing on the record with my name on it. She testified to everything, including her own crimes, refusing the deals that would have hidden them, and she served her own sentence, shorter than it might have been because of her cooperation, but real, and she did not fight it, because, she told me the day before she went in, Finn died for me, and 100 people I hurt deserve to see me answer for it, and I would rather be a person who paid than a person who got away. I've spent enough of my life being the second kind. I visited her every month she was inside. She's out now, and she works, quietly, in the foundation we built, doing the unglamorous patient work of undoing harm. And we are not what we were as children. That's gone. The family took it, but we are something. A brother and a sister who each survived the same machine and are each spending the rest of their lives making sure it can't be built again. It's not the reconciliation of a fairy tale. It's better because it's true, and it was earned, and nothing about it was easy. And Coraline and I, we did the thing she'd wondered about on the balcony the night before the gala. We didn't just destroy the two houses, we rebuilt them. With her grandfather's seal and the loyalists she'd turned, Coraline took her rightful place as head of the Thorne clan, the heir the old man had always meant her to be, the granddaughter they'd called a monster, now the patriarch in truth. And I, the disappointment, the joke, the family failure, took the ruins of the Ashford holdings that no one else was left to claim, and with Silas Croft beside me, and the people at the bottom who'd carried the house for 4 generations finally standing in the light, we built something my mother would have recognized. We merged the two houses at last, for real this time, not as a lie to cover a theft, but as an actual union. The Thorne and Ashford clans made one, and we did with the combined fortune the thing our fathers never would have dreamed of. We gave most of it back. Not carelessly, Coraline would have skinned me for carelessness, but deliberately, over years, into the docks and the mills and the city that 4 generations of our families had bled, into fair wages and honest work and a foundation in my mother's name and Coraline's grandfather's, the Isolde Caldwell and the Thorne Founders Trust, which exists to do the one thing neither family ever did, which is to remember whose backs the fortune was built on. We kept enough to live and to build. We gave the rest to the people it had been taken from. And every worker at those docks knows that the family that owns them now is run by the fool the old Ashfords threw away, and the witch the old Thornes tried to bury. And they know exactly what that means. And there has not been a more loyal or more prosperous operation in Ashcroft in 100 years. Because it turns out that a house built on remembering whose backs it stands on is far stronger than one built on forgetting. Let me tell you about the rebuilding, because the destruction of 2 rotten houses is the part people want to hear about. The gala, the fall, the arrests, but it was never the part that mattered to me. It was only the door that had to be broken so the real work could begin. The real work took years, and it was slow and unglamorous, and I loved every day of it. We made Silas Croft the first director of the docks, a man who'd been demoted and forgotten for 17 years for the crime of loyalty to my mother, and he ran them until he was too old to climb the gantries, and then he ran them from a chair, and the first thing he did, the very first thing, was institute a rule that no worker's family would ever go without care, funded from the top, from us, because, he said, your mother wanted that 30 years ago, and your father laughed at her, and I have waited 3 decades to see it done. I was there the day the first families received it, and I watched a dock worker named Alara Quinn, whose husband had been crippled on an Ashford crane years before and cast aside without a cent, receive the support that should have been hers all along. And she looked at me, the failure son turned head of the house, and she said, your grandfather would have let my Tom rot. Your father did let him rot. What changed? And I said, the people who run this house now are people it threw away, so we remember what that feels like. And she wept. And I understood that this was the whole point. This was what my mother meant. This was worth every night I'd spent believing I was worthless. We built the foundation, the Isolde Caldwell and Thorne Founders Trust, and Coraline ran it with the same terrifying competence she'd brought to the war, and it did the patient work of undoing a century of harm. And Genevieve, when she came out, worked there too, and I watched my sister spend her days repairing the exact kind of damage she'd once inflicted, and it was not redemption in the neat sense. There is no neat sense, but it was something. It was a life spent on the right side of the ledger at last. And the 2 clans, the Ashford and the Thorne, the ancient enemies whose feud had been a lie, became one house in truth, run by the disappointment and the witch, and the old society of Ashcroft. The glittering people who'd laughed at our wedding did not know what to do with us, because we did not play their game. We did not hoard and posture and pretend. We built things and gave things back and remembered names. And slowly, over years, the city that had built Coraline into a monster and me into a joke came to understand that it had had it exactly backward the whole time. That the 2 people it had thrown away were the only 2 who'd ever deserved the power, precisely because they were the only 2 who'd known what it was like to have none. People ask me sometimes whether I'm angry that it took nearly dying to find my life. And I tell them the truth, which is that I am not, because the same night that showed me my family wanted me dead also showed me the woman who didn't. and I would not trade her. I would not trade any of it. Because the trap my father built to bury me is the exact trap that gave me Coraline, and a man cannot regret the road that led him home. My mother wrote, in the letter she died for, "Be brave, and do not be alone. Find someone they cannot buy and cannot break, and fight them together." I found her. My father handed her to me himself, thinking he was handing me a murderer, and instead, he handed me the one person my dying mother had told me to find, and we fought them together, and we won. And now, we build together. And that, in the end, is the whole story. Coraline and I still live in the great dark house on the North Cliffs, though it isn't dark anymore. We filled it with light and noise and people, and it is nothing like the tomb it was the night I sat on the edge of that bed waiting to die. We have a daughter now. We named her Isolde, after my mother, and Coraline says the old founder, her grandfather, would have adored her, this small, fierce girl who fears nothing. Last spring, she found the little wooden ship on my desk. She was 5, and she picked it up in both hands, the way you hold something you understand is important, and she said, "Papa, this one's not very good." And I laughed until I had to sit down, and then I pulled her onto my knee, and I told her, "You're right, it isn't very good. A little boy made it, and he wasn't very good at making ships. Why do you keep it?" And I thought about how to say it to a 5-year-old, and in the end I said, because a long time ago, a lot of people looked at that little boy and said he wasn't worth much. And one person looked at him and said he was. And she was right, and they were wrong. And I keep this on my desk so I never forget which of them to listen to. And my daughter Isolde, who is named for a woman she will never meet, looked at the crooked little ship with enormous seriousness and said, "I think it's a good ship," and set it very carefully back in its place, and went off to torment the dogs. And I sat there for a long while afterward, not moving, because 17 years of my life had just closed a circle in the hands of a 5-year-old, and I hold her sometimes at night, and I think about the man who tried to bury me, and I think, you built a trap to end my line, and instead, you gave it a beginning, and there is no revenge sweeter than that, than a life, than a home, than a small girl named for a murdered woman who was right about everything, laughing in a house on the cliffs where 2 people the world threw away decided to build something true. On the night I was married to Coraline Shaw, the cursed witch of my enemy clan, my entire family laughed, and my father said, "Let the failure rot with the snake." He was wrong about the snake. He was wrong about the failure. And he was most wrong of all about the rot, because the rot was never in the 2 of us they threw away. The rot was in the houses that threw us. And in the end, the failure and the snake were the only 2 clean things in 100 years of lies. And we did not rot together. We rose. So if there's a lesson in all of this, and I've come to believe there is, it's the one my whole life taught me backward, and my marriage finally taught me right. Be careful who you throw away. Be careful who you call a monster, and who you call a fool, and who you decide doesn't matter. Because the people a cruel family discards are the people who owe it nothing, who see it clearly, who have learned in the cold exactly how it works. And when a family builds its whole rotten empire on the certainty that the ones at the bottom will stay there, all it takes is 2 of them, 2 the world underestimated, 2 who refused to be alone, to bring the entire thing down. They married me to my enemy to be rid of me. She turned out to be the only ally I ever had. And together, the disappointment and the witch, we buried the ones who buried us and built a home on the ground where our graves were meant to be. My name is Adrian Thorne. My wife's name is Coraline. And this is the story of how the 2 people no one wanted became the only 2 who were ever worth wanting at all. The end.